You know what that sound means. It's time for class again. Thank you for joining us. We got a good one for you today. Something that it, what did I just describe it as? A moron Italian job.
Yeah.
We're talking the assassination of Abraham Lincoln today. Something I think that most people, even outside the country, have at least some awareness of.
I would think so.
It's one of the first times. Well, it's not one of the first times a world leader was assassinated, but
No.
for our country, it was the first time that it was successfully done.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, because that's the Secret Service was invented after that. That guy you heard trying to think and then eventually agreeing with me. Guys, he's finally doing it. He's opening his own ice cream shop. He's going to call it the Stone Cold Creamery. He's the KC to my JoJo. He's the Bobby Lee to my Ulysses S. Grant. You thought I was going to say Andrew Santino, didn't you?
Yeah, you
No.
got me.
No, yeah. The fact that I had to hear Robert E. Lee referred to as Bobby Lee during several podcasts, that's exactly where my mind went, was to Bobby Lee. That's Professor Adam, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, boy, we got one today. I think you're right. I think that there is more of a reach for Lincoln outside of the United States and his assassination than I think I ever really put stock in.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I don't know if there would be, because he was pretty important for us. I was thinking about this too. Abraham Lincoln is, I think, a very popular president now.
Mm-hmm.
And I always think that it's a little bit different when somebody talks about like their favorite president. Like if you twisted my arm, it would be probably between Teddy Roosevelt and LBJ, just because Teddy Roosevelt did a bunch of fun shit and LBJ had a nickname for his dog.
It's more so about the character of the person than
Yeah.
the actual, like, what they did. Weirdly enough, like, as long as they didn't, like, fuck up the country too much, then you're just like, okay, what did they do outside of office? And then you're like, okay, that was pretty cool. And you got to love LBJ because World War II, and wasn't he 4 terms? Or was that Franklin?
Franklin.
That was FDR.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. That was FDR.
No, LBJ called his Ding Dong Jumbo. And
That's right.
yeah, he was Vietnam times. But it's
Was
just
that why he was in the wheelchair?
because it was so heavy.
Yeah.
But in this situation, I feel like Lincoln is a very, very popular person. I actually know a Lincoln cosplayer that like goes around and travels to schools and does like Lincoln presentations. As I learn more about Lincoln, I feel like death, and you and I talked about this, death did nothing but benefit Lincoln.
It's like a form of graduation goggles.
Yeah.
Once he's gone, you kind of realize it, and you think of him, and you think, I will remember you.
You don't think about him declaring martial law during the start of the Civil
No,
War.
you don't. And I think I kind of made this point too. The way I see it is that the last thing he did was so major
Yeah.
and looked upon in such a positive light. Well, to some people, not to some of the people in the story, but in such a positive light that he had no time to fuck it up. There was no poor decision that was made after that. There was nothing to bring him down after that. He was still on a fucking high, just like trajectory that was taking him and making him more popular. And then he ends up dying. So like they're like, oh, what we could have accomplished had he been here. So he's only remembered for the huge positives that he did. But again, like the more you learn about him, the more you just figure out like this was just a fucking dude. This was just a man that was put into a pretty fucking crazy position of a new country literally tearing itself apart and being like, what do I got to do to keep this shit together?
The last 15 presidents didn't have to deal with shit like this.
Yeah.
And hopefully, God willing, no other president will. But at the same time, his positioning, he was a railroad lawyer. He wasn't
self-taught.
Yeah, he wasn't like a guy who was very well versed in diplomacy. So he went about it in a pretty ham-handed way. But again, we did win a war that was going to cause 2 countries.
He made enough right decisions. Eventually, we talked about it during the Civil War episode. It took them a long time to get the right people into positions to where they could actually turn the tide and actually win the war. But he just made enough right decisions that it kept the ship. It may have been going back and forth, but it kept the ship generally going in the right direction until it could actually be won.
And then he benefits from recency bias because he gets shot in the head like a few days later.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Well,
yeah,
who's the guy that does it?
John Wilkes Booth. The triple name that gets associated. Do you think that they give killers 3 names just so there's not like the ability to look at like a John Gacy and be like, oh shit, you're John Gacy, your name's John Gacy? He's like, no, that guy was John Wayne
I think
Gacy.
they do try to do that. Now that I'm thinking about it, that makes a lot of sense to make sure that like that you don't have all the names that match up because yeah, you got Lee Harvey Oswald or Lee Harvey Os. Jesus, I can't say his name. Lee Harvey Oswald, John Wilkes Booth, John Wayne Gacy.
Serial killers left and right. I mean, it's just it has to be like the most definite way to talk about a killer so it doesn't cause other people issues.
Yeah. It still causes them issues,
Yeah.
but they have at least a middle name to try to separate that. This is, if I take away anything out of the study of this topic and finding out new information, it was essentially that John Wilkes Booth was not just a random guy that did this. Stars had to align for this to happen, and he was in a prime role to actually serve as the guy that was going to be the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. And this guy is born in Maryland.
Oh, we got to start the episode.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, guys. Got a little ahead of myself there.
Let's re-get into it.
Yeah, let's re-get into it. Read. God damn it, not read. Rate, review, subscribe. Read the social media posts, I guess is what I'm getting at.
And you got to read to find that podcast.
That's true. Okay, so yes, guys, do read. But we're getting into Lincoln. Okay, yeah. Wow. I just wanted to dive right in, man. I'm excited.
Yeah, we got... spoiler alert, we got stoned before this episode.
Yeah.
So just like every other episode, but
It's business as usual.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. John Wilkes Booth, born May 10th, 1838. Yeah, we're not in the 1900s. In Bel Air, Maryland. Parents were, was it Junius? Mm-hmm. Junius Brutus. Coincidentally, Brutus was his middle name, right?
Yeah.
So, Junius Brutus Booth. Brutus, of course, being the person that famously turned and stabbed Julius Caesar. Not sure if it had any type of ties to that.
I hate this so much. We'll talk about it later, but...
Well, Junius sounds like a Roman name anyway. And then Mistress Mary Ann Holmes. He was the 9th of 10 children. They were getting busy.
Yeah, and this wasn't Junius's first family. Junius actually, he's an immigrant, came from Great Britain. Mary Ann Holmes was also, she came over with him. He had a wife and a son back in England, and he was the kiddies titties when it came to actors on stage. Junius Brutus was a very, very big deal over in Britain, and so much so that he attracted the attention of Mary Ann Holmes, and they had a little bit of a fling. Junius wanted to start over, so he told his wife and son that he was going to go over and be an actor in stage plays in America. He moves over there with Mary Ann, and he's still sending money back to his original family, while at the same time, him and Mary Ann are banging out 10 children.
Yeah.
And I don't think they were married for a very, very long time, which I don't really have a judgment on, but back then that was very unheard of to move to America with your mistress and then just bang out 10 kids.
Listen, if you're not married by the 5th kid, what are we doing here?
Yeah. Well, I don't think they legally could. It actually does come back and bite Junius in the ass because his wife gets wind of it and comes over to America, which I can't imagine that boat ride did a whole lot for her mood when she finally got over to Junius to talk to him about it. But out of the 10 children, Junius and his son Edwin, and then there was a Junius Jr. that were all major actors.
And actors at this point essentially are stage actors. You're either working at a playhouse, probably going to be in the major cities. Of course, you're going to have DC, New York, Boston, places like that. Also, places in the South where you're going to have theater. But to be a known actor at that time, I mean, it took a lot because first, like, you had to not be a traveling actor. You had to be somewhere and be performing enough times that people would actually recognize you. And this comes into play in a major way as part of the assassination. I don't know if it was just that not a lot of people were attending the theater, so there was just a certain section of people that only went there, so they became familiar with all the actors, or he was just in that many plays around these areas.
I think he was. I'd seen, well, and we'll talk about John Wilkes here in a little bit, but they had like these residencies where it was 6 nights straight, and sometimes it would be 2 showings. Mm-hmm. And so they would be there in town for a week, and you would have 12 opportunities to see. And this whole thing, I don't know why it was just a big blank spot in my mind, but this was literally the only form of entertainment you had back then. Like, there was nothing else. There was no TV, there was no pictures, there was no fucking cars.
No radios.
Yeah, dude, there was nothing else to do. So I assume that this would be like us going to a movie in the 90s on steroids.
100%.
So
because there's nothing else.
Yeah, his name would be on playbills everywhere around town as they're marketing it. Like, John Wilkes Booth is a big guy, just like Junius was, because he was like the only game in town.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I mean, how do you follow in your father's footsteps and try to make him proud? He ends up, well, before he has a chance to follow in his father's footsteps and make his dad proud, his father died at age 14. I don't really know. I mean, if he was the 9th of 10 children, I got to assume that Junius was probably getting up there in age.
I would imagine.
We're talking 1860s. At 14, he still had one more child after John Wilkes Booth, so he was...
That's how he died. Making that 10th child, yeah.
It took him till 16 years old to finally get on stage, and when he gets on stage, it does not go well.
He doesn't have it.
No. At a certain point, he even drops the Booth from his name because he said he didn't want to sully the reputation of his brothers and his father.
I'm no longer John Wilkes Booth. You can just call me John Wilkes.
Like, we're not going to know.
Yeah.
But he was a piece of ass.
Yeah, he was a good-looking dude.
Shockingly enough, I know early pictures don't do really anybody justice except for somehow Abe Lincoln.
It's not that it does him justice. It's just Abe Lincoln is such a distinctive-looking person.
Yeah.
If I, for some reason, was just staring at a picture of Abraham Lincoln, I'm like, he doesn't look like anyone, and I don't know if it's because the beard disguises his facial structure and it kind of shapes it in a way.
Yeah.
And I've seen pictures of him without his beard, and he has a very, like, kind of a weak jaw. It's like a very shallow, but then you look at him and he's just like this weathered, stoic, I don't know, it looks like a sketch of someone that was being described. I don't know. He's very, very unique looking.
Yeah, it's almost like all of his features are so defined that everything has a shadow and a wrinkle to it.
Like gaunt.
Yeah.
And everything. Yeah.
Him without a beard is fucking unsettling.
Yeah.
I do not like looking at Abe without a beard. But along with being a very handsome man, John Wilkes Booth turns into a really, really good actor. He starts to travel a little bit. He starts to see kind of the United States. Again, this is pre-Civil War still. Mm-hmm. He ends up headed down to...
Not like super pre-Civil War, because essentially he's still going to be young when all this happens. But there's some tension growing between the North and the South, but it hasn't broken out to full war. One thing about him, too, and his family, is they lived in Maryland. And Maryland was one of those states where even, once the Civil War kicked off and everything, and you had certain states abolishing slavery that were in the North, you had Maryland that was still a slave state. So, I mean, they did have slaves when he was growing up. The Booth family believed in slavery. They thought it was a good thing. They thought that if you read John Wilkes Booth Manifesto, I'm not going to read it now because it's just fucked up ramblings, but he believes that, like, by keeping black people as slaves and just bringing them out of Africa and making them slaves here, that they were somehow advancing them. and it was all good for them.
Because they were able to meet the Lord and become Christian.
Yeah.
That was his reasoning, was slavery was good because black people were allowed to meet Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I think a lot of people probably had that
Yeah.
that rationale about a lot of other cultures.
Well, when you're trying to cover up something shameful, you gotta talk about the Lord to kind of...
You just a little Jesus shine on it. Yeah, there you go.
Doing this research, and I know that we haven't done a lot of... Well, I guess we've done some kind of racially tension episodes. This is the most times that I've heard the N-word doing research, like by far. And it's so...
Because you're hearing the writings of someone.
Yeah.
You're hearing the actual,
And it is weird to hear white people saying the N-word. Like, it's... I totally understand why they do it. It's in a historical context. It was his writing. It's a little bit like, what's the book, Huck Finn?
Yeah.
N-word Jim. Like, you keep that in, and I do think... as terrible as it is to hear that word and like as unsettling as it is, there is a certain need to understand like this was the feeling. I don't know if there's a more charged word to hear a white person say.
No, I don't think there is. And I think I don't want to say it's a shock value thing, but that was always something that's been in discussion, like about Huck Finn.
Yeah.
So it's always stayed as part of a controversy, and I think maybe that's why his writings are more well known, because maybe he had something that people were constantly talking about. I don't know.
True. Yeah.
They were Unionists. His family.
Oh, yeah. For the most part, they were. I don't know how you are a unionist besides like maybe you've had enough of slavery to where like you have enough money to where you can get by and you don't need them, so you can just kind of go away from it.
It could also mean they were Unionists in the sense of like before they were starting to make stuff, being like, okay, we need to start phasing out the slavery thing and starting to tell southern states kind of, hey, let's go ahead and start dialing the practice back. They could have then moved over. They could have had, that's like when someone says, they're capitalists, but they like a bunch of socialist type shit.
Yeah.
It doesn't define them, but they could have believed initially in that. Regardless, he definitely, John Wilkes Booth himself, was not.
No. And kind of around this time, he heads down to Richmond, the capital of the soon-to-be Confederacy, and starts working in theaters down there. And he was very, very good down there. 1860 is finally when he goes national. I didn't realize that Walt Whitman was more than just like an author.
No, he was a politician. Didn't he have a cabinet seat or something?
He was a reporter at one time for a newspaper.
Yeah, he was a politician, though. He had some type of political appointment within Lincoln's administration because he wrote a poem about Lincoln after Lincoln had died, and he did it from, I can't remember what seat it was. I'll look it up real quick.
Whitman wrote in the article when he was doing the review saying, without having Edwin's, his brothers, culture and grace, Mr. Booth has far more action, more life, and we are inclined to think more natural genius. It's a pretty flowery statement to make about a guy who is about to kill a president.
Yeah.
Like, he was that popular. And as he gains this fame traveling all across the country, he's doing a lot of rooms in the South. And he's...
Oh, I was just going to correct myself. Sorry. Yeah, Walt Whitman wasn't a politician. I could have sworn I heard that he was some type of politician. Maybe it was that... Yeah, you're right. He was a journalist. But, oh, Captain, my Captain. I had no fucking clue that was about Abraham Lincoln.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
You always hear that, remember, like Dead Poet Society, like, oh, Captain, my Captain, and you'll hear that if someone's just referencing generic poetry. It was written by Walt Whitman about Abraham Lincoln.
Do you think more people know Walt Whitman now from the Breaking Bad reference of Walter White and Walt Whitman and his assistant that had the Walt Whitman poetry?
I believe there was probably, after that episode, there was probably a lot of Google searches to
Trying
find
to
out
figure out
about
who the fuck Walt Whitman was.
Exactly. Was he like a meth dealer too?
But as he's down in the South, he kind of falls in love with the je ne sais quoi of being in the South, a Southern gentleman, Southern belles, kind of all of the things that we glamorize now, along with all of the things that we're against now too. Those things went hand in hand back then. So as you think about, the suits and the flowery dresses and shit like that they were wearing, he also really ate up the slavery part too.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, if you want to kind of get his thoughts on it, read his manifesto. I don't want to read it on here just because there's a lot of shit in it. The start of the war, he actually wasn't in the South when it started. He was up in Albany, New York on April 12th, 1861 when the war started. So he's kind of at the peak of probably his top, peak popularity as far as an actor goes. Now the war starts. There's some animosity because John Wilkes Booth was definitely outspoken in his support for the secession, calling it heroic. Basically, the North was like, hey, man, we can't have you traveling around to all these theater shows and basically just getting on stage and probably spouting out this kind of stuff in Union areas. So you're going to actually be banned from the stage for making what we consider in the North, because it's not like we were just like, yeah, please secede from the Union. It was, no, you put articles in for that, but we didn't agree to it. So technically that's treason, and you're up here making treasonous statements.
Well, and that was just Albany too. He still was in many, many plays all over the North, and he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way for making these statements. I forgot to put on the board a little bit earlier, but before the start of the war in 1859, he actually attended the execution of John Brown. So John Brown's rebellion,
The one that took place in like St. Louis. It was in Missouri.
Kansas, maybe.
It was one of the.
It could have been Harper's Ferry. I think it was
Okay.
in Virginia, maybe.
Okay.
But he wanted to be a part of this so bad, and he wanted to be a part of the Confederacy so bad, but he had made his mother a promise that he would not join in any capacity of the war. So what he did was he gave some of the Richmond Greys, it was like probably a Southern militia outside of Richmond. Mm-hmm. He gave some guys some money so he could get this Greys uniform, and he actually went to John Brown's trial and then to his hanging, and he stood guard between the trial and the hanging.
Yeah.
To make sure that nobody would come to John Brown's rescue. So he was actually cosplaying a Confederate soldier. He thought that John Brown was a bad person for trying to give slaves a way to defend themselves in this rebellion. They broke into a fort. We'll do a whole episode about it. It sounds very cool. They broke into a fort. John Brown got a bunch of guns. He was trying to arm slaves so they could rebel and they could make it up to the North. Didn't like John Brown for that, but he liked the balls on John Brown. He liked that he was willing to take the risks. While at the same time, he's like, oh, I got to have a front row seat to this. I got to make sure that I get there and see that nothing happens. So that was kind of like his first taste of wanting to be a Confederate soldier and wanting to further the cause. And then right after that, Lincoln gets voted to be the president. Another thing that I didn't know about, and it sort of makes sense when you think about it, there were 4 people that were running for the presidency that year, and Lincoln got like 32%. He had the lowest popular vote of any president in the history of the country.
Mm-hmm. But it was the largest percentage.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, I guess you could get more than 50% of the vote with 4 people, but if you're splitting the vote 4 ways, you're not going to get, 25% would be equal, so 32% still more, but 32% is not a high approval rating.
No.
Because those people still could have voted for you.
Well, when he got reelected, was it 44% at that point?
I think he ended up getting more, but we'll talk about the concessions that he had to make with his cabinet to get that close. But as soon as Lincoln comes in, the Civil War, those states, I think it was 7 initially, secede immediately, and we have the start of the Civil War. Another just odd thing that I learned about Lincoln that really I had never thought about, but in order to stop Maryland from seceding, because they were a slave state, they had feelings of, warm fuzzies towards the South.
The northern capital was literally inside of Maryland.
Yeah. Pretty important to keep Maryland a part of the Union.
Yeah.
He suspends habeas corpus, and so you are able to be brought to justice without a trial or anything like that by whoever sees fit if you're talking, poorly about the Union. The actual vote for secession, Lincoln had stopped a lot of the Maryland Congress members, arresting them for certain things to stop them from getting there to vote for secession. Maryland ends up staying a member of the Union through a vote that I think was like half as much as would have been voted if they had shown up.
They're kind of the black sheep of the Union because they're still doing a lot of stuff that, like, technically the Union's standing against. But because strategically they have to keep them in the fold, it's kind of like, okay, listen, we're going to let you keep doing this, but, like, be quiet about it.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to declare martial law and we're going to suppress all this from happening. Which, at any other point in time, if a president now declared martial law or suspended habeas corpus, I don't even know if we fucking use habeas corpus anymore. I think you do in, like, trials and certain things.
Okay.
Because you have a writ of habeas corpus. But if any president were to do that now, I'd be like, what the fuck, dude? That's not cool. That's not a good thing to do. But at the same time, you kind of have to make your peace with it because had he not done that and had Maryland fallen to the Confederacy and had the Civil War not shaken out the way that it did, I don't know if we would still be a slave country. I highly doubt it, I think, at this point. I think everybody probably would have bullied us out of it.
Yeah, I would imagine.
But at the same time, we would have been a slave country for a hell of a lot longer than we were.
Yes, it would have been much closer to its current day than it was.
So you kind of got to take the, hey, that wasn't a great move. I could understand why people weren't happy with what Lincoln was doing. Like, not to say that I was pro-Confederacy, but I think there was a lot of people in the North and the Union that were like, whoa, dude, too far. But Abraham Lincoln knew that you had to do that shit.
Correct. You are going to see that come back into play like you're referring to, or like you're alluding to, when he needs to get reelected, because those people that voted him in first, those aren't going to be enough to get him elected again. So he has to find a way to kind of bolster his, essentially the pool he's going to be gathering voters from. We'll get to that here in a little bit. Kind of getting to the actual place where this is all going to go down. November in 1863, Ford Theater opened. And coincidentally enough, J.W.B. was one of the first leading men to go and perform at that theater. He was a Greek sculptor in the Marble Heart. And apparently, because this was really the only game in town, or one of the only games in town for entertainment, the theater had a specialized presidential booth. So the president apparently did make frequent visits to the theater. This is going to come back into play of why this location was selected. It wasn't just, he's showing up to this place, let's get in there and do this. It was planned out. And during the performance, when John Wilkes Booth was, I don't know if he was giving some type of monologue or something like that, but basically looked up at Lincoln and made eye contact with him and basically gave him like the Matumbo, no, or like, you've been naughty, up to the presidential booth, because he was staunchly against the Union and what Lincoln stood for.
They had a few run-ins that just kind of surprised me, because again, usually when an assassination like this happens, the assassinator is unknown to the assassinatee. With this, Lincoln was like a fan of John Wilkes Booth. There were on more than one occasion, Lincoln would see one of his plays, and he was taken aback by him enough to where he would send somebody down to invite him to come meet him. Like, Lincoln, he wanted to meet John Wilkes Booth and, like, say, hey, you're great, I love your acting.
Yeah, there were a couple offers to come visit him at the White House.
So, and of course, Booth turned him down every single time. But this one time that he points up to Lincoln pretty sternly, I think it was either his mom or his sister-in-law or something leaned... Or no, it wasn't his mom. Jesus Christ, definitely wasn't his mom. Either his wife or his sister-in-law leaned over like, ooh, I think he's kind of pointing your direction. And Lincoln's like, yep, yeah, that seems like it's pretty much for me, huh? Like, there was an understanding that even though Lincoln respected him and liked watching him act, that his feelings towards Lincoln weren't great.
Art from the artist type situation.
Yeah. So you have John Wilkes Booth in D.C., working at the Ford Theater. He's still touring a little bit. He's still making money. He is so famous. I mean, it's at that point in time, he was, who'd you say when we were talking about it, Ryan?
Oh, wait, I was just trying to make a comparison between, like, it'd be like if Ryan Gosling, went and killed the president at this point. They said that, like, in today's money, he would be making, like, $500,000 a year, which the inflation rate of just normal money versus the inflation rate of like actor salaries, they're on a completely different scale. So he would probably be making more as an actor these days. But think of him as like a really popular television actor that people have seen several times. And this comes into play in the fact that because he is seen around Ford's Theater so much that when he shows up at Ford's Theater, no one is paying really any attention other than the fact they're like, hey, that's John Wilkes Booth. He's famous. It's not, hey, what's that guy doing here? He looks suspicious. It's like, oh, yeah, this makes sense. He should be here. He's a theater actor.
Yeah, he's supposed to be here. He's practicing lines or he's going through a walkthrough, something like that.
At some point during his, and I don't know if it was I imagine it would have to be post the start of the Civil War, but he may or may not have had some type of connection with the Confederate Secret Service. It makes sense, and it doesn't in several ways. It would make sense in the fact that he never served as an actual soldier in the Confederate Army, but being that he had the type of career and job that would allow him to travel around the Union, he also was probably in some inner circles. It probably would make sense as being a famous actor if he was able to meet and greet like army officials or anything like that. He was someone that the Confederacy could use to gather information 100%. And so I could see it in the fact of like with him being down there, him offering his services and being like, because he had to have also been meeting with like Confederate military people like guests of theater performances, being like, hey, I would really like to do something for you guys. I could see them being like, yeah, sure, we can use this guy.
You travel to the north all the time.
Correct. And it's all win for them. What's going to happen if he ends up getting caught or dying? It's just like, oh, it's just one guy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was low risk, high reward for them. So I could see that being a possibility. And that kind of comes into play of what the whole plot that is eventually going to evolve into the assassination starts out as. On July 30th in 1863, we're a couple years in. Didn't it start in 61?
Yes.
So we're a couple years into the Civil War at this point, and there have been some big key battles. Prisoners have been taken on both sides, and up to this point, there has been the agreement of prisoner exchange of POWs. The South doesn't want to go ahead and give up black POWs. They're not willing to go and release those people, despite them being fighting for the Union Army, being officially recognized as fighting for the Union Army.
They were free men in the North.
Exactly. They weren't turning over those prisoners. It got to the point where Lincoln was like, okay, no, we're not going to do this anymore. He knew he had the advantage in terms of population and size of the army, and that not having prisoners returned would be a lot harder on the South than it would be on the North. So he issues General Order 252. I think we talked about this during the Civil War episode. Go back and listen to that, and it'll have a lot of the fill in the gap type information. But basically, he was like, we're going to stop prisoner exchanges with the South until all Northern soldiers will be exchanged without regard for their skin color. And so at that point, John Wilkes Booth is looking at this, and as I wouldn't even say like a Southern sympathizer, as a Southerner, as a Confederate, he was like, well, shit, this is hurting us.
Bad news.
This is very, very bad. And so they start to develop this plot essentially where in order to give them an ace in the hole, they start to think of an idea of maybe kidnapping Lincoln. This isn't an assassination plot when it first starts, but if they're able to kidnap Lincoln, get him back across, basically just across the Potomac, because that would take them into Virginia. Is that right?
Yeah, and Richmond, I want to say that Richmond was less than 100 miles away from D.C.
It is so weird to me, that fact. Like, we talked about that during the Civil War episode, that the two capitals were so close to each other, and yet they really were never occupied until, like, very close to the end.
Yeah, they were nose to nose the whole time, but somehow they defended themselves successfully being that close.
But basically, they could kidnap him, get him across the Potomac, and then use him as leverage for a huge exchange for prisoners from the South to be released back. That, again, would then bolster the ranks of the Confederate Army, because they were essentially just turning those guys right around. And Lincoln was like, I'm not going to keep sending you fucking guys when you're just putting rifles back in their hands to kill more of our guys, and then we have to capture them again.
Give them a meal, a pint of whiskey, and a rifle, and send them right back out on the front lines. I feel like that's extremely short-sighted that was the whole plan. Because if you take what would probably be considered the king on a chessboard at the other side, and you just hold him hostage, you're going to be able to get back more than just POWs. I feel like you kind of win.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, you're not going to win, but technically you're going to be, if you can't keep the president safe, what's that going to do to the morale of like the people you're fighting for?
Yeah.
Like, fuck, how inept are we that we let them capture the president? Again, even from a Confederate standpoint, this is low risk, high reward for them. If something happens and these guys go in to kidnap Lincoln and they're unsuccessful and they all get killed, Confederacy, what was the name of the president of the Confederacy?
Jefferson Davis.
Jefferson Davis holds up his hands and be like, that wasn't us. Like, that was just a group of like, it was like 5 guys that were trying to do that. That wasn't us. We wouldn't do that.
And it was probably guys that didn't like him on your side.
Exactly. So he actually recruits a few guys to help him out with this plan to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. So you got the ringleader, you got John Wilkes Booth. One thing about him too, and I text you about this because I forgot we even discussed it during the Civil War episode. He was also a Knight of the Golden Circle, and the Knights of the Golden Circle were a Southern pro-slavery movement who wanted to establish the capital of the Golden Circle, of what they called it. It would be a large portion of the southern states surrounding the Gulf of, or the Caribbean, right? The Gulf of Mexico.
Yes. Yeah.
States that were going down along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico in Mexico, and then the states that also are in the countries that wrapped around in South America, and then all the islands in there. So like Cuba, Haiti,
the
Dominican
Caribbean.
Republic, and they would turn the capital of the Golden Circle. They would put that in Havana.
Well, and for as stupid and far-fetched as that idea was, which, again, untold how stupid it was, at the same time, all of those islands and everything down in the Caribbean were all a massive part of the slave trade. So it's not like you would be going into unfriendly areas down into the islands to...
You were going where there was no fight against it.
Yeah.
And then you had a buffer zone of all of the United States, the southern United States, that were between you, and if it did, the secession did succeed, play on words there, you had this huge buffer zone of these southern states before they could even get to your capital, and then even then they would have to reach it by ship.
Yeah, the slowest way possible. Mm-hmm. And you can just be like, look, man, you can't see what we're doing down here. Maybe if you don't like it, just don't come down here.
Yeah.
So I mean, there was a strategy to it. Still unfoundedly dumb. Just a very dumb idea.
Definition of a pipe dream.
Yeah.
We get another guy. His name is George. Is it Azeroth? Azeroth. He was a German-American Confederate sympathizer. His mission is, when they're first planning the kidnapping, these guys are just kind of like have little roles, like this guy's going to go ahead and procure a boat to make sure we can sail away.
Yep.
This guy's going to have like the getaway horses ready, or the wagon ready that we're going to have to throw Lincoln in. This guy's going to have to go around and map the route, or we have a guy that's like a woodsman and a tracker in case we have to not go across the Potomac and we have to try to lose people in the woods. So they have these guys that are kind of trying to fill these different roles. This guy named Lewis Powell, he was an American Confederate soldier. He had actually confirmed work for the Confederate Secret Service and had served in the Confederate Army. David Harold, he is going to be sent with Powell when they get assigned these different missions. And
incredible pussy.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Well, there's a couple of those in here. And then we have these people named John Surratt and Mary Surratt. Mary Surratt is the owner of a boarding house outside Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
I believe it was a tavern in Maryland outside of D.C., and then she moved to a boarding house and purchased a boarding house in D.C.
It was Surrattsville. I think it was the town named after them, was where the tavern was at, just outside D.C. And then because they... that's where they kind of, all of the conspirators met to actually plot, the kidnapping and everything, where they met at this boarding house that was run by Mary Surratt and her son, John.
I don't remember. I do know a couple of them were his childhood friends. There was a guy in there named Michael O'Laughlin, too, that kind of plays a tertiary role. I think it was Lewis Powell and David Harold were his 2 childhood friends, because there was something about how he wanted people in his inner circle. And then throughout that, you had to get, like you say, these specialists. Azeroth, being the kraut that he was, had a thick German accent, but he was really good at navigating the Potomac or something like that. Like there were certain guys that had sets of skills.
He's
that
a river
they
man.
would need. Yeah, this was
on my river.
This was the fucked up Italian job. Everybody kind of had their own semi-strengths.
Getaway rower.
Yep. So this whole idea comes together at this place called the Surratt Tavern. This doesn't always seem like kind of an important thing where these things take place. The Surratts actually come in very, very big in this story in two really interesting ways. But the plan after that was that Mary would move to a house in D.C., this boarding house that they procured, and it would help them get them closer to the president.
It's also the perfect cover. You're running a boarding house. If that were to just be a private residence and you constantly have people coming in and out of it at all times, large groups of guys, it might draw attention, not essentially from whatever you would consider to be law enforcement at that point in D.C., but people are also on the lookout. Like, there is a type of, like, attitude in the air that being in DC, people are probably on the lookout a little bit more vigilant for people that are being suspicious.
You got the Pinkertons there. The Pinkertons are there trying to root out these Confederate spies.
There you
We
go.
talked about it in that episode.
But by having a boarding house, people come and go out of a boarding house. You have people staying there at all times.
Yeah. In this plan, I think kind of this plan to take him out as far as kidnapping him, it stretches back to like 64. And between 64 and 65, Booth had stopped like working. Like, he wasn't actively an actor in plays. He like kind of stopped his life to focus on this, and he kind of slowly starts to slip into this delusional state of, I don't know, being flipped. Like, his brain was finally indoctrinated so much with his own self-hatred for what was going on and what he perceived to see the South falling. He knew that he needed to do something, and I think at that point, the South wasn't looking great. I don't know if the South was ever really in it. I know during the episode on the Civil War, we talked about it, and it kind of seemed like the South had an advantage in the beginning, and then
Due
once
to the ineptitude,
yeah,
it was more like the Union kept shooting itself in the foot, and the South just were not making mistakes.
yeah, and then eventually the Union finally got some people in power where they're like, hey, we got the numbers. If we can grind these dudes out, they're not going to be able to survive it. So I'm sure that was kind of a mixture of what was going on in Booth's head. March 4th, 1865, Booth actually attended... do you know his mistress's name?
Booth?
Yeah.
I don't recall.
She was the daughter of a senator.
Oh, that's right. Look it up, because I'm going to mention something about Booth as well with this boarding house.
Okay.
So during the time frame that they were planning this kidnapping, they really didn't have an end date, it sounds like. They weren't like, we know that Lincoln is going to be here in 2 months' time. Because he was traveling around so much and because everything was so chaotic due to the war, his movements essentially weren't well known. So they were essentially also kind of like doing stakeouts where they were watching him to find out if he was ever alone at times, if there was ever, less security with him at times. And they found that he would actually travel either with one security guy or, it was with just a driver, I think, in his carriage.
No security for a fucking president during a war. Lucy Hale.
Lucy Hale. So he would do this only at certain times when he was returning, I think, from a certain location. And so they had started to kick around the idea of being like, listen, if we're going to do it, this is when we're going to strike. We'll be able to go ahead and hold the carriage at gunpoint, get him out, get him into another wagon, and then get out of here. There'd be no security to stop us. So in order to do this as well, as not only are they meeting up to plot at this boarding house, Mary Surratt's boarding house, they're also starting to store weapons and everything in case this thing has to turn into a shootout or any of that kind of shit. So he's definitely gearing up for something. And as kind of time goes on, there's some debate about when it went from a kidnapping to a murder plot or to an assassination plot. But there came a point, too, when in March 4th in 1865, he actually attended Lincoln's second inauguration in D.C.
And that was Lucy Hale, his girlfriend, who they were planning on running off together. It had to be a secret thing because her father was a sitting senator. He had asked Lucy for tickets to the inauguration. So he wanted to get close.
To introduce kind of another person that's going to come into play, during his first term, Lincoln, what was his VP's name during the first term? It doesn't really matter. The guy wasn't very popular, and because Lincoln also knew that, certain decisions made during the war, maybe things weren't going as well as they should in the public eye, he needed, like I was mentioning earlier, to kind of like grow his pool of voters he could pull from. So he actually decided to pull in Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson essentially, Lincoln was a Republican. Remember, back at this point during the Civil War era, Republicans and Democrats, what you think of today, would be opposite. So it was Republicans were left leaning and Democrats were right leaning.
Yeah, the ideological swap that didn't happen until later on in the 1900s.
Yep. So
that's where you get the term Dixiecrats.
There you go.
Because they were Southern Democrats.
We're not changed our name.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's a Southerner. He's from Tennessee. Lincoln chose him as his running mate because he essentially had to offer some type of like token that you're going to have a voice here too. It was probably almost as even like, listen, I'm going to be president for the next 4 years while we get this Reconstruction thing going. But then, because this guy's my running mate, and this comes into certain conspiracy theories later on.
Yeah.
If something should happen to me, you guys are now, have representation there, or during the next election, he'll be someone that has experience and has maybe proven himself, and he can get elected and be your representative of the, we're all going to be the United States, but then you feel like you're also invested in this because you have a Southerner that he did it for the votes.
Yeah, and the political landscape was so different back then because there were, like we talked about, supporters that were Republicans up north that were on Lincoln's side, but there were also Republicans up north that were anti-war, just like there were Southerners that were mostly pro-slavery and to be that way. But there was also like hey, we don't want to be at war either. So there were war hawks, the Copperheads, I think they were called. Yeah. And then you had the people who just didn't want to be at war and wanted peace. But at the same time, there was kind of like four modes of thought.
You had people that were in the north that owned large pieces of land in the south and were making a ton of money. So you had northern pro-slavery people. You probably had people in the south that didn't own slaves, that thought, morally it wasn't a good thing to do. So you had people that in the south are like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have slaves. So you had kind of people all across the board, but to reach out to a larger portion to actually win this election, which was essentially even more crucial because he kind of had the ship going in the right direction, so he needed to finish this job. But yeah, during the inauguration, sorry, getting back to it, John Wilkes Booth was there and was basically talking to, I think it might have been, you mentioned it might have been Powell.
Yeah.
That they were there.
Pretty sure it was Powell.
And I mean, they weren't that far from the stage.
No, there's a picture where you can see him in the background.
Really?
Yeah, like it circles him. It's a black and white picture that's not great back then, but they circle him and say that's John Wilkes Booth right there. And judging from where the picture was, I don't know how accurate pistols were, but he was a shot away.
Well, and he kept telling Powell, he's like, you know what, you have a good chance here. This would be a great chance for you just to shoot the president, wouldn't it? Like, not wanting to, like, have the guilt himself and everything, being like, oh, I do it, I'm just not as good of a shot as you and everything, but you should totally do it right now.
I honestly think the only thing was that he didn't have a gun. I really, truly believe that Booth would have done it because he was so fucking angry at Lincoln at this point in time. Had Booth been the one with the gun, I think he would have taken a shot at him. But this is where I think that Powell probably wasn't like, he was on board with the kidnapping. Kidnapping's one thing, but shooting the president at an inauguration seems like a bridge too far at that point.
All right, so we got Andrew Johnson as his running mate. So they end up winning the election, obviously, because he was at his inauguration. So on March 17th, they got wind. So again, this is just a few days. This is like less than 2 weeks after the inauguration. There's basically, it's known that Lincoln is going to be going to a play, I think, at the Campbell General Hospital.
Just did plays at hospitals, I guess.
It was probably an auditorium that they had that they could hold a lot of people in. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of words that they used back then for things that we very much specialized into like one thing.
Could have been a benefit for the hospital. I don't know, fundraising if they did that kind of stuff back then. But basically, they planned to actually kidnap him. Was it on the way back from that?
Yep.
So as he was leaving that at night, they were going to go ahead and, hold up the carriage driver, kidnap Lincoln, and abscond with him to the south. Well, he ends up going to a ceremony at the National Hotel instead of the play. And at that point, a huge missed opportunity. But John Wilkes Booth, wasn't he living at the National
Yes.
Hotel?
Yeah.
So he had left
Yeah.
the National Hotel where Lincoln was. So like I just imagine them like he goes out, gets in a carriage, clop, 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 and then as soon as he turns a corner, you see this procession come around the corner, and it's Lincoln's entourage, and they pull up, and it's like, Mr. President, Mr. President, and he goes in.
It would have been so easy. It would have been so easy.
Not to kidnap.
No, I don't think Booth had half a mind to kidnap at this point. I think that second inauguration, and we'll talk about the next time that he gives a speech, how pissed off it made him. I think that second inauguration might have pushed Booth past kidnapping. But I don't know how that's an intervention that can happen, that it's just the weird coincidence.
I mean, there were probably only so many places to stay and only so many nicer tiered places to stay. So, like, the National Hotel, of course, like a famous actor might be living at the National Hotel. Well, it wasn't even long after this, April 11th, is considered the fall of the Confederacy. So prior to April 11th, that is when Robert E. Lee signs the surrender of his part of the army.
At Appomattox Court.
Yes.
Yeah, the city of Appomattox Court inside the parlor of that gentleman's house. Mm-hmm. It just, he won. I mean, he did it. They made this happen. He won the war that he had set out on, like, this is what he was supposed to do.
Yeah.
I don't know really anything else. I think he definitely is a push for ending slavery while at the same time not really being against it. So good that he did it, but it wasn't really his belief. But this is a huge win. And just like you were talking about at the beginning, when you're coming off of a W like that, there's only going to be good feelings.
Yeah.
You're only going to be...
It's your time to shine.
Yeah. And if you do that, if this happens April 11th, you're feeling kind of hot the next few days. April 14th, you want to go out. And that's... I've always heard that, like, Lincoln was a pretty depressed guy. And, like, even when we were talking about describing him and you said the word gaunt, gaunt kind of puts an image in your head of, like, what kind of a guy he was.
What did they call depression back then? Because it's always been a thing. Melancholy.
Yeah.
That's how they would describe depression, is he's got melancholy.
But I do think after winning this war, even he was like, fuck, dude, I'm going to take a victory lap. This is awesome.
Yeah.
April 14th, the day in question, John Wilkes Booth was already at Ford's Theater. He showed up to pick up his fucking mail. Because
you didn't mention what happened on the 11th.
Oh, shit. Yeah. Okay, so I missed that. April 11th, fall of Confederacy, Lincoln gave his last speech, and he promoted the voting rights for emancipated slaves. I believe Wilkes Booth was also at this speech, in the background somewhere. But when he did this, Booth just absolutely lost his mind. This might have been the one where the shooting was going to happen, I think.
I think this was where it went
100%
from not only... At this point, it might have still kind of been a kidnapping. Something was still in play. And the thought process behind the kidnapping is, hey, maybe if we kidnap the president, the war is still so new from being over, and there's still armies in the South that haven't maybe surrendered or haven't really, demobilized or anything like that. If we can get this big win of capturing the president and holding him as a trump card, maybe that would actually even get us better conditions if we still have to surrender, but it would be a fucking ace up our sleeve to maybe even try to revive this.
Yeah, I think this was the shooting speech because Powell wouldn't have been able to go with him because it was a ticket thing that he had to have to go to the inauguration.
That's
speech.
right. Okay, you're right.
So,
I retract that. Powell was not there. This is when he nudges him and tells Powell that he should shoot him.
Yeah. So I think hearing that black people were going to be able to vote,
he freaked out that they were going to become citizens.
Yeah, it something blew in his head that day where I think he might have ratcheted this thing up.
Like, oh, okay, so you're just saying that because someone gets brought here involuntarily that they shouldn't be allowed to be citizens. They're fucking here just like you are.
But they were given Christianity.
Which is more important than voting rights?
Yeah, because you don't need a vote in heaven.
That you know of.
Yeah, true. It's a good point. Maybe they run elections up there too. But he's been... I can't fucking figure out why this word, like when you're flipped, like when you're not indoctrinated.
Brainwashed?
No, like when you're flicked on.
Oh, activated.
Yeah, activated's a good word. But I think this is when he finds out that he's going to have to do something a little bit more serious than kidnapping. So, again, now that Chris caught that, because that was a pretty big point before we went into Ford's Theater, he shows up to Ford's Theater to pick up his mail, oddly enough. And as he's there picking up his mail, he heard that Lincoln and Grant were going to be attending the performance of Our American Cousin. I'd like to see Our American Cousin. I think that there was something in Our American Cousin that kind of sounds fun. It was an American that has to go back to, I believe it was England, and charm the pants off his future.
It's like a real King Ralph situation or fish out of water
Yep.
type situation. I think what you were looking for. So like it's like when a sleeper agent is activated.
Yeah. There's a. That's kind of what it was. So,
Triggered or yeah.
Yeah. Eventually, I mean, thinking about it that way, I could see maybe like they had indoctrinated him enough in the South that maybe he was a sleeper cell that they just waited until he finally blew his own top.
I don't know if they had the knowledge of psychological brainwashing like that. I think they just found people that maybe at this point too, man, this could have been something where fucking John Wilkes Booth, the last time he spoke to like fucking Southern Command or whoever it was, Confederacy Command, they might not even have known he was still doing anything up there.
Well,
Like at that point, once they were surrendering, like his file was back here and they're like, oh shit, is this operation still going on right now? Like we got other shit to do. Start packing up.
And if the South had truly fallen, this means that the train carrying Jefferson Davis and everybody had already left the station. They're probably not in great communication with the spies up in D.C. I don't think that the spies really have a whole lot left to do because the South is just completely fallen apart.
At this point, it becomes a personal thing.
Yeah.
It's his mission.
Yeah. To me, this is kind of the moment where this changes from what it could have been to just how it has to end. I don't think Booth would have gone out without trying to do what he did.
So we come to the fateful day, April 14th. So at noon, JWB actually goes in to pick up his mail from Ford's Theater. And through the scuttlebutt of everyone talking excitedly, hears that Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant were going to be attending a performance of, like you said, Our American Cousin that night. And he's just like, fucking say what? And they're like, yeah, Lincoln's going to be here. And he's like, fan-fucking-tastic. Now, again, he's just finding this out now, and he's got to try to rally all the troops. This is also at a point when you can't pick up the phone and be like, hey, everyone needs to meet up at this place. You have to literally find someone or send a messenger or go try to find all these guys yourself within the time frame of this day, because if you can only find one or two guys, maybe you try to do a smaller version of the plot, but to actually do the entire plot that they've come up with, you need to have all your players there.
Well, and I think everything kind of extends out too at that point, because we go from just a Lincoln kidnapping to a Lincoln assassination, but the assassination is only like a third of the plot.
So the whole plot actually involves not only assassinating Abraham Lincoln, but basically trying to chop enough heads off the snake to where it completely debilitates the Union. That's going to include Vice President Andrew Johnson. It's also going to include this guy named William Seward, who was the Secretary of State. He was probably less surprising that he was in that position than Jackson, because he was more of who you would expect for like Lincoln to put into that position. He was a Republican at the time. He was anti-slavery. He was the dude that actually negotiated the purchase of Alaska.
Oh, good for him.
Yeah.
That kind of makes sense, because I think that's a town in Alaska, Seward.
Maybe. I wouldn't be surprised. So the plan becomes essentially a three-prong attack to John Wilkes Booth by himself going to Ford's Theater, where he has been seen multiple times. He's not going to go ahead and turn any heads in the wrong direction being there. He can probably get close to Lincoln by using his clout and his status as an actor that's been to that theater. Lincoln has seen his shows. He's going to have the best chance of getting in there and taking care of Lincoln. You then have Powell, we discussed him earlier. He's actually sent with David Harold, to kill Seward. And Seward, at the time, I think, was bedridden at home because he had a carriage accident. I love when they just refer to it like it's like the precursor to a car accident.
Yeah.
He was in a horrible carriage accident. He like broke his jaw and like had a head wound or something.
Yeah, and it was like 8 days out from that happening, so he was still bedridden. He wasn't going anywhere.
Then you have George Azeroth. He was the guy he was the German American guy, and he was sent to kill Johnson.
Yeah, this is my favorite guy.
And I think Johnson at the time was staying at a hotel, or was it the National Hotel?
It wasn't the National Hotel. I think it's going to come up here.
Okay, he was staying at
Kirkwood.
a hotel. There we go. The
Kirkwood
Hotel.
Oh, I never really thought about it, but I heard it described in, it was either a podcast or a documentary. I didn't realize that you could have like 5 and 6 story buildings back then.
Super, super rare.
Yeah, but this Kirkwood Hotel, I think they said was 6 stories.
So it was literally the tallest building.
It feels like a really big building for back then, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would have had to been built like out, like big.
Really blew me away.
Probably the place to be in D.C. So after John Wilkes Booth, a little bit earlier in the day, after he hears about Lincoln showing up there, he goes to the Surratt boarding house. He sends a package to the tavern in Surrattsville. I don't know what was in the package. I just know that it's been mentioned, so I don't know if that comes into play at a point. It's just something he did while he was there. Told one of the girls working there to ready the guns and get them ready because they were going to need them. And at 8:45, he's able to go ahead and gather all the key players in this, and this is when the conspirators meet for the final time.
When he actually makes a trip midday back to Ford's Theater and goes up to the presidential box, and he mortises, he carves out a spot in the door frame for him to be able to jam a piece of wood in there to block the door for once he gets in so nobody can come in after him. Rips a piece of wood paneling off the wall, gets it measured up, tests it out, puts the piece of wood paneling back into the wall, and just hopes that by the time he gets up there that night that nobody had fixed it or done anything.
And that's what he was going to jam in to bar the door?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the whole setup up there, they had done some...
He also drilled a hole.
Yeah, he drilled the peephole.
He drilled the peephole so
door.
he could make sure, like, what position Lincoln was sitting in, and, if he had to subdue whoever was outside or if it wasn't covered, he wanted to basically be like, well, I can't go through the door if someone's turned around facing me, or if Lincoln's not sitting in this spot and that's where Grant's sitting, I have to kind of, like, alter how I'm going to go about this.
And they said that the Fords had gone into like their personal furniture collection and chosen the rocking chair that Abraham Lincoln was going to be sitting in. They also dressed up the booth. I forgot the word, but basically they hung like American flags all the way around it.
Yeah.
So it was like very well.
Like I think the stuff that you see kind of like on 4th of July celebrations where it's like just the red, white, and blue, except it's stripes.
It's like a banner kind of.
Yeah,
it's tucked up. That'll come into play very big. But he had figured out where Lincoln was going to be sitting, so he got all set up in there. He was able to set up his kind of how he was going to do it. And word got out that Lincoln and Grant were going to be at this play. It was like hot news around town.
It got put out like in a newspaper or something. It got announced.
Real World War I Franz Ferdinand vibes a little bit. Just announcing where this guy's going to be only so many days after he just beat the South.
I know it's like a celebration, but it's still a time when people are probably the most pissed off.
Oh, yeah.
So you'd think you'd be a little bit more fucking hush-hush about it.
Yeah, just I don't understand what the thought process is, and I think that's what drives me nuts the most about this, is they're at a time when you have to be protecting this guy that's running the country that just won you this war, and we don't have a Secret Service. We just have a guy that's riding around in a carriage with just a driver. Like, there's not even a second guy. And coming up into this whole thing, going to the theater...
The driver was like his guy.
Yeah, but
like
that's...
a multitask. But, like, what the fuck are you supposed to do when you got the reins in your hand?
Uh-huh. So, this whole plan really only works because Lincoln's not protected. You can grab that one. Lincoln has to be... in a situation where he can be got to. And if you don't do that, if you don't protect him, he's just going to be taken. It's a situation where it seems like it's so cut and dry, and maybe now it's because we see the Secret Service around anybody political. But I'm not going to say that assassination isn't like always an ever-present danger.
Oh, it is. I think
You think?
100% it is. I just think there's so many layers between it that no one attempts it. That's the deterrent. It's like
Yeah.
a nuclear deterrent that like the whole point about like having nuclear weapons is to make sure the other guy doesn't use theirs because it's the same type of thing. But yeah, I mean, and this is something like there had been assassination attempts on Lincoln before. Like at one point he was riding his horse or something like that, and he had his like hat shot off the top of his head.
Big dumb fucking stovetop hat.
That's probably why he had it, to make sure people didn't know what the level of his head was. Because if he
Yeah.
was wearing a regular size hat, they could maybe fucking guess where his head was.
I see that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, self-preservation, man. But it shouldn't have been something they didn't expect. I just think they were fucking kind of in that honeymoon phase of the war being over and like nothing could touch them. They were unbeatable. It just came down to some really fucking mind-boggling decisions. Well, what would end up happening is they plan to kind of carry these hits out simultaneously shortly after 10 p.m. Now, I'm assuming that, didn't look this up, but pocket watches, were these a thing?
Oh, this is the biggest issue that I have with this time, and I hate when I say it because it just sounds like such a douchey thing to say. Time's a construct. There's no fucking way that these guys were able to have timing. Like, this is the
It wasn't
1860s.
synchronized watches.
How do you know if your watch is running fast or slow? Is there just one clock tower in the middle
That's
of the
what
city?
I was actually going to say. I wonder if you were living in an area that the general rule of thumb was that you set your clock to try to match what like the town clock was. That way, if anyone within the town is like, be here at 5, everyone is on the same time.
And that was just like an official thing.
I don't fucking know.
And then,
but
like-
that makes sense to me.
Yeah, but like if they're coming down from Philadelphia and you're like, well, shit, he's 5 minutes early, and they're like, oh yeah, Philadelphia's actually 5 minutes ahead of us here. Like, there's no way to synchronize those
It could
things.
have definitely been something like that. But I completely see that being a possibility.
I don't believe that they were able to keep time so much. And self-admittedly, I have a really tough time with a lot of these documentaries about this because I feel like we should all have one cohesive story. And between documentaries, podcasts, and everything else, everything is kind of tweaked a little bit in the way that some things happen and some things don't, and the timelines and everything like that. It kind of makes me worried, and I don't know if you notice this. I think you probably notice it because you watch a lot of the documentaries when we do these, is there's no real documentaries within like the last 15 to 20 years, even probably into the 90s that have
'cause
covered this.
Nothing new has been determined about it.
Yeah, but
you'd see a bombshell if someone figured out something new.
But I feel like we need to continue re-recording these documentaries because you start to get these historians replaced by podcasters.
Yeah, that's
that are
true.
telling these stories.
They could tell the same story, but do it in a more easily digestible or fun way, which I like to imagine that that's kind of what we try to do, is
Yeah.
just make it into like a friendly thing where you can learn some shit that you might not have known before, but you can still laugh at.
And at the same time, we don't claim to be historians. Historians play a very important...
Historians, but
Yeah, historians, yes. But historians play a very crucial and important role in telling these stories over and over again. And I just shudder to think, like, 50 years from now, I don't know if YouTube will still be a thing, but will we have gotten so far away from Lincoln documentaries that it's like watching the old shitty, like...
No, what'll end up happening is here within the next couple of years, there'll be a series or a movie called Booth. And it'll be the story of John Wilkes Booth and the Lincoln assassination. And it'll become really popular and it'll put back in the public eye. But that's just simply because going back and trying to find interesting things in history that haven't really had, it's like one of those things that where it's not so established or well known that you can't take creative license with it.
Yeah.
And add in certain things. I would not be surprised if this ends up becoming a series because stuff does comes back in vogue, and maybe by the time the Lincoln assassination comes back, it's not going to be just in a documentary format. It'll be in a more entertainment-based format.
I don't like that, though. I feel like we need the
They're
sterility
doing it with everything
of...
else, but I'm not saying I like it. I'm just saying I think it's kind of an inevitability.
Yeah, I feel like we
And
need...
it'll give us better numbers on this episode if it can happen
Yeah, but we need to stick to complete facts, because we give you, like we say, I think we said 80%, 90% is usually what we shoot for.
Don't make John Wilkes Booth sexy like when fucking the Dahmer
that was a
documentary came
bad
out.
choice.
Everyone's like, it's hot Dahmer. It's like, don't make fucking
He
John
ate people.
Wilkes Booth.
I don't think you guys understand. He fucking really was real and ate people. So again, just talking about the timing and how all this stuff worked. The most unlucky person, and I say that fully knowing that Lincoln gets shot in the head. The Grants ended up canceling, and when they canceled, they were just replaced by the next man up, a guy named Major Henry Rathbone.
He was like third in line. There was another guy after Grant, and the only person that was like in town. So Ulysses S. Grant, he had been, he 5 days prior went and did the surrender, and then he hadn't been home for a while, and I think they lived in Jersey, and apparently his wife and Mary Todd didn't really get along. Mary Todd seems like she was a pretty cool, outspoken woman, so like that might have rubbed some more traditional women the wrong way.
Yeah.
So she didn't really get along with her, and so I think it was one of those things where the Grants were just like, she's like, I don't want to go, and he's like, hey, we can't make it. We haven't seen our kids in a long time. We're gonna head back home. I don't want to, take another day. And then there was another guy that they went to go select, and he's like, yeah, we can't. And then they finally went to this guy, because they went all the way down to Major Henry Rathbone.
True, yeah.
And they were like, and he was probably like, fuck yeah, like I'm going to the play with the president. That works for me.
So you don't think that there was any sort of sad feeling that he got the call because Grant had canceled, even though Grant was billed to be there? Like he definitely thought he was a second choice, right?
I would like to think,
just with the way this ends for him.
If he had any level of intelligence, he would have known that he was a little bit lower down the list.
If he had any bit of intelligence, he wouldn't have been hanging out with the president in such a public place.
Buddy, being seen with the president, do you know what that could do for you from a political standpoint? Just to be like, I was the guy that he selected to be in that booth with.
Yeah, I guess.
And all these guys, like how many of these generals and guys went into politics, and how many of them ended up being president?
I look at it as a life thing. But,
so,
did you hear anything or read anything or see anything about this Lincoln premonition that he had?
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into it.
Do you believe it? I don't believe it.
No, because it comes from one person that was talking about it, and the guy ends up being, surprisingly enough, someone that wasn't involved in this instance.
Yeah.
But someone that was close to Lincoln, but he didn't come out with it till 15 years after. In a nutshell, Lincoln, for like a couple nights in a row prior to this happening, had premonitions that he was going to die, and it apparently mentioned to this guy who was like his bodyguard and valet and driver or carriage driver and everything. But this guy didn't mention it till like 15 years later. It's something that, like, I guess just adds a little bit more spice to the story, more tragedy to the story. Like, oh, he saw this coming, but I don't know if
Yeah,
it could have been a dream where he was like, oh man, like I fell off a cliff when I was flying, and then I hit the bottom. He's like, you dreamed that you died?
Well, it was that felt like he was waking up and could hear people stirring around, and he was at a funeral and knew that he was at a funeral, and then didn't realize that the funeral was for him until they started talking about like how sad and tragic it was. And then the guy said some shit like, every time that Lincoln had left before that, he told me, good night, I'll see you tomorrow. And this was the one time he just said goodbye.
Yeah, I don't know. Here's the other thing too, man. Would it really be that surprising if you just led the Union to this winning the Civil War 5 days before? In your head, you're riding the highest of highs, but at the same time, that melancholy part of him and everything in the back of his head is like, what's the worst thing that could happen right now? What's the thing that could happen now that I've accomplished this? And it could have been, he's like, oh, if I died. And if he goes to bed thinking about that, yeah, he could have a fucking dream, but that doesn't make it a premonition. That just says it's on his mind when he happens to be going to sleep.
Dude, I have dreams that I die after eating a chicken parmesan that night. I can't imagine dreams that you would have fighting the Civil War.
Yeah, no shit. Getting the fucking casualty reports and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd probably have some fucking nightmares. If it's okay with you, I want to save what happens with Lincoln last and talk about the previous. Yeah, the other.
Let's do the fun stuff first.
Yeah. Who do you want to start? Do you want to start with Powell or do you want to start with Azeroth?
Let's start with Powell. Let's save Azeroth for a second.
Okay.
I want to see somebody get close to accomplishing their goal first.
So we get Lewis Powell, and with him is David Harold. Now, Powell was not familiar with the layout of Washington, D.C., so this is why Powell was sent with him. Basically, Powell was sent there, I'm not sure in what capacity other than leading him to the house, probably to stay outside while he did the business. And then
Harold was the one that was going into, or that was guiding him, right? Powell was the one that was going inside?
Yes, so he was leading Powell to the house.
Okay.
Powell was then going to go inside, and I think Harold was probably going to hold the horses. So Powell ends up showing up to William Seward's house. Again, he's bedridden at this point. And so at home with him at the time were his butler,
Servant.
his servant, his son, his daughter,
Fanny.
his daughter Fanny.
Yep.
And then there was one other person.
I want to say it was like an advisor.
It was an advisor or someone like a military officer, but not like a combat.
It was another male.
Yeah, somebody else.
And then his wife.
Yeah, so he knock, knock, knock. Hey, I've been sent urgently with some medicine for, Mr. Seward. I need to go ahead and make sure that he gets it directly. There's specific instructions in regards to this medicine, and I've been charged with doing this. And his butler was like, yeah, that doesn't sound right, but you can go ahead and leave the medicine with me, and I'll make sure he gets it. First of all, really, that's your plan? What are we gonna do? Well, he just got hurt. What do hurt people need? They need medicine. Okay, say you have medicine and that you have to give it to him. Like, you're not his fucking physician, and you probably don't know the name of his doctor, but you're here to give him medicine.
Mantis Toboggan sent over the script. Mm-hmm. Dr. Toboggan needs me to give this suppository. You can't find his asshole, but I can find his asshole.
Yeah. So, of course, he's not buying it. Powell forces himself into the home and starts to head toward, I guess, basically what he thought was going to be Seward's room, or kind of was searching through the house and everything. Do you want to go ahead and describe what happens next?
He runs into his son, and they go through the exact same discussion he just had with the servant. He's like, hey, I got to get in there and give your dad this medicine. And he's like, my dad's not accepting any guests right now. And he was
fucking resting, motherfucker. He was in a horrible carriage accident.
So Powell decides that his best course of action is to stab the son and then run past him.
Didn't he pistol whip him in the head?
No, he makes it to Seward's room and sees Seward in bed, pulls out his revolver. This is another weird choice. Just remember, he has a revolver, goes to fire the revolver at Seward. The gun jams. So luckily the gun jams when he fires the shot at Seward. That doesn't happen. Seward gets out of bed and they start to struggle. As he comes up, Seward uses the butt of his gun and Powell uses the butt of his gun and bashes Seward on top of the head. That takes Seward out of the fight.
Well, Seward wasn't really even in the fight because he's bedridden.
True, but he was still putting up an effort. At that time, his advisor came into the room, and him and an advisor got into the scuffle. Powell ends up stabbing the advisor, and then using the same knife that he stabbed Seward's son with, and then the advisor with, he also stabbed Seward. So Seward ends up getting knocked over the head with the pistol, and then he ends up getting stabbed. I think he ends up in a coma at some point after this. Regardless, his wife also ends up getting stabbed by Powell. I don't believe young Fanny got stabbed by Powell. She didn't take one in the fanny. But while this is going on, the screams from inside the house, Harold starts to hear. And once Harold hears the screaming from inside the house, he's like, fuck this. This was supposed to be a one shot and done and clean and out of here. I got him bail.
So it was the son, actually.
Oh, they got hit?
Yeah, so what ends up happening is, just going into a little more detail. So they get to the top of the stairs. His son Frederick stops him, and they go through the whole spiel. And because they're making noise, Fanny sticks her head out of Seward's room and is like, hey, he's trying to rest.
Oh, okay.
And so she puts her head back in, closes the door, and Frederick's like, listen, yeah, he's resting. You got to leave. He turns to leave and then turns around and puts the barrel against his head to shoot Frederick.
I thought he tried to fire at Seward.
No. He ends up firing, it misfires, and then he actually pistol whips him. And I think they said it hit him so hard that, it cracked his skull.
Was he the one that was in a coma then?
It might have been. So he knocked him to the floor. Someone ended up running out of the house screaming murder, murder, and basically was like trying to go for help. And I think that that's also when he came out screaming that Powell was like, the fuck? And could you imagine he's the guy sitting out there holding
Harold,
the horse? So after that happened, because the gun misfired, he pulled out the knife and went into the bedroom. His army nurse was there. That's you were talking about, George Robinson.
Okay,
and then the daughter. So Powell actually tries to slash Robinson on the forearm. The soldier goes down. He pushes the daughter aside and gets onto the bed, and then began knifing Seward in the face and the throat. So I'm guessing, like, I don't know if he was stabbing him or anything. The guy survives. Seward doesn't die.
Tough.
Everyone in this instant ends up surviving. He was wearing a metal and canvas splint on his jaw because he had broken his jaw, and it deflected most of the blows. So after he ends up, like, he does draw some blood, and after he sees enough blood, he's like, I've stabbed this guy so many fucking times, he's got to be dead. So he ends up, thinking he's dead. And by this point, everyone is fucking making noise. Murder, murder, all this shit's going on. He then runs outside, and guess who's already fucking gone?
Harold hightailed it.
Yeah.
I do wonder how long Harold stuck it out. Like, if once the lady ran past yelling murder, if that's when he exited, or he heard enough to where he's like, this isn't going well. He's been in there too long.
All in all, he stabs or slashes 5 people. All of them survive.
Bad with a knife.
He's lucky he was wearing that, like, facial splint.
Yeah, you would never say thank Allah for a carriage crash.
Yeah, I would imagine, too, it's probably one of those situations where he's wrapped up in bandages like you see in movies. Because if you saw someone just wearing something on their chin, you're probably not going to be like, fuck, like, you're just, like, slashing fucking anywhere and everywhere you can.
Or go 8 inches down to the left on his body and stab him in the heart.
Maybe, yeah.
It feels like you could probably...
I don't do that. I'm a slasher.
More of a slash guy, yeah. So yeah, he ends up bailing out of the house. Excuse me. Harold is not there. Harold is gone, and Harold was going to be the way that he made it back through the streets of D.C. all the way back to the tavern in Maryland. So, he's kind of in the wind. We don't know where Harold goes at that point. Now we get to George Atzerodt, and this guy is quite the guy. His job was to go check into that same hotel that Johnson was going to be staying in.
The Kirkwood?
The Kirkwood, yes. And goes, checks in, gets a room. I believe I heard a couple sources say that his room was right above Johnson's. He's a little nervous about this. I don't know if he's killed before. He's German, so this was kind of when...
Maybe not even that. The fact that, like, knowing how high profile this is, even if someone is killed before, how high profile this is and how much pressure there is on this, because this guy is not the type of guy that's like, I'm doing this for martyrdom. I want to make sure I'm getting out of this alive.
Well, and you're tagging the VP too.
That's exactly it. And in a hotel full of people and probably with like some type of security outside, maybe. Yeah. And then at the same time, just thinking to yourself, like, how the fuck would I get out of here, even if I somehow got into his room? That's just got to be waiting. So what do you do if you're having an existential crisis like that?
Oh, you got to go to the hotel bar.
Yeah.
You got to go down and get yourself a drink, get yourself lubed up with liquid courage. While he's down there, he asks the bartender if he knows that Johnson had checked in or not yet. And I'm sure the bartender's like, the fuck, dude? I sling the drinks. I haven't heard or seen anything. This is kind of weird. Why are you asking? How do you know he's staying here?
Well, word on the street is he's staying under the name Mickey Mantle.
And this is weird to me too. Why is the vice president staying at a hotel in Washington, D.C.? I know he's from Tennessee, but you're telling me that we don't have a residence for the VP yet, that he has to stay in the Kirkwood?
I don't know.
That seems so odd to me that he wouldn't have like a second home in D.C. because we already have the White House.
Like a little staycation or something. Also, just thinking about it too, travel at this point is very slow.
Yeah.
Because it's horse and carriage. That if you live across town and you're doing something on the other side of town, it might make more sense to be like, do we really want to go home tonight? It's going to take us an hour or 2 hours just to get back across the city to get home. let's just get a hotel room for the night.
Let's crawl into this straw bed at the Kirkwood Hotel. Mm-hmm. So, Atzerodt has one drink, has two drinks. He didn't know how to cut it off in that sweet spot between not enough courage and just piss-ass drunk.
He missed that sweet assassination sweet spot.
Yeah, he might have gone one too many. Ends up leaving the hotel and just basically stumbles around drunk on the street until he actually stops in at another hotel, completely forgetting that he had a room at the Kirkwood. Mm-hmm. Checks into another hotel and just passes out in the new hotel. The next day, and I guess this is kind of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but when they hear the Lincoln assassinations happen and they're looking around, they end up hearing kind of some scuttlebutt from the bartender about a guy asking where Johnson was because everybody's in high alert at that point. They go up and check his room. They find a pistol. They find a knife that were both hidden underneath the pillow, probably for safekeeping. Mm-hmm. And then they find bank records, like statements of payment from John Wilkes Booth to Atzerodt.
Yeah.
That to me seems really weird if you're trying to cover this up. Because if one head of this snake falls off, you don't want it to kill the entire...
Correct. Here's my thought on that. Because I think where you're getting at is like it's a little too tidy to tie him to it. Here's my thought. So he had the room. At the point when you have a room like that, you don't have a house there. So maybe you have the things on you that you're just normally carry around with you. Now you go up to your room, you're taking stuff out of your clothes and everything like that. You set the stuff down. He never went back to his room, I don't think. I think he got drunk in water. So I think the whole point was he was going to go down and have a drink, go back to his room, get the stuff to assassinate him because all the weapons were still there. He would have then grabbed the bank records, taken it all with him when he left. He just never anticipated that he would bar to the street. He never went back to grab any of that, which makes sense to me.
You think he woke up the next morning and he still had the key from the Kirkwood Hotel in his pocket? He's like, what the fuck is that? Oh, I was supposed to do something last night. What are the chances that Johnson maybe had a heart attack or something like that last night?
0. So he pretty much says, yeah, I'm out. I'm not going through with this. So
fucks off all the way to like Ohio, wasn't it?
Something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so 2 out of 3 all happening simultaneously have already failed.
He fucks off to his cousin's ranch in Germantown, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
I wonder if they just had a town named Germantown in Maryland.
Probably.
Yeah, I could see that maybe.
So, getting to essentially what's now the main event in this, and this is why generally it's not known that the assassination plot for Abraham Lincoln involved 2 other, the VP and the Secretary of State, is because neither of those succeeded, whereas this one did. So this is why those aren't even really talked about when you're learning about the assassination. So John Wilkes Booth ends up showing up to the back of Ford Theater, and it was... Obviously, it was a little bit before 10 because he had to be there and kind of, he wasn't going to sneak in. He had to enter in a manner which looked like he was just coming into the theater. He had belonged there. If he's like skulking about, coming in through the back, he not only has a better chance of being stopped because he's being suspicious, but also his escape would then be compromised because possibly, they would be looking for someone that had been sneaking around backstage, and even if he made it past them. So he gets to the back door. He gets off his horse, sees someone that he knows. I don't know what the guy's capacity was. If he was a janitor.
He was like another actor.
And basically he's like, here, I'm just jumping in real quick. I'll be right back out. I need you to go and hang on to the horse. Hands him the horse. He then has to find a way to work himself in to the theater. So that guy thinks he's going in. But he has to find a way to get out of the theater and go around to come in the main entrance. So it looks normal for him coming in the main entrance. I don't know the exact details of how he does it, but he ends up coming into the main entrance.
He popped underneath the stage. He went via trap door underneath the stage.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he actually ends up leaving and goes next door because he needs himself a little liquid courage and has a couple drinks before he comes back in and goes to the main entrance where you were talking about.
Okay.
So even he needs a little bit of something to take the edge off what could be potentially about to happen. And that's important because that same bar is going to come into play here very shortly.
So he goes in And there's a couple sections that basically it's not just like you walk in, you turn this way, and it leads all the way up to the president's box. There's kind of some partitioned areas and like some doors that are closed. But surprisingly enough, he meets with relative minimal or zero resistance.
Why though? Why would he? He's a very famous actor inside of a theater. I mean,
He's used to people
yeah.
coming and going. He's famous. Maybe he just wants to meet the president or something like that. We might as well ask him because we don't want to be the guys that said, "Hey, John Wilkes Booth wanted to meet you," but we told him no and have President Lincoln pissed off at us.
Yeah, you're going to allow the second most famous guy in that building to do what he wants.
Yeah, exactly. Well, because the stars had to align for this to happen, the normal guy that would be Abraham Lincoln's like bodyguard, chauffeur, all that kind of stuff, he's actually off duty for the night. And this guy to fill in, his name was William Crook, was unavailable. There's some conspiracy about maybe why he wasn't available. I don't know if he had just, I think maybe he had been protecting Lincoln for the earlier part of the day because this is all the way up to like 9 or 10 o'clock at night.
That's what I saw.
And I think it was time for him to change shifts. So this guy named John Parker, who was actually a cop in D.C., is sent to go ahead and take over. Well, first part of the play goes off. John's like, I'm not really digging this performance. This is getting kind of boring here. So what does John do?
John fucks off to the bar across the street where John Wilkes Booth had just been having his drinks at. And this whole thing, they actually showed, the party shows up late. They stop the play and they play over, I don't know if it was like a PA or if they just had the band play it.
I think they have a band probably.
Yeah.
Or at least some type
an
of
orchestra
section.
Something like that. But they play like the presidential fight song.
Hail to the Chief.
Okay.
Dun, 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 dun,
That was a song back then?
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. They play that. He comes into the booth.
You know we don't update our shit. Amendments, sheet music, the Constitution, any of that shit, we don't update it.
Yeah, hey, I guess they think if it worked back then, it should still work now. They get seated. So it was like everybody in the entire theater knew when Lincoln showed up. And to a lesser extent when Rathbone showed up.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're in this play. This play's going on. It's happening. John Frederick Parker is fucked off. He is over getting drunk at the bar, which I assume he probably has a few regrets later on. But, excuse me, John Wilkes Booth goes up. There's an attendant outside the door. He says, "Hey, I'm John Wilkes Booth." I'm sure the guy's like, "Holy shit, you're John Wilkes Booth." He's like, "Can I get in there and see the president?" The guy's like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So he lets him in. Once Booth gets past that first door where he had mortised out that spot, goes over, grabs the piece of wood, jams it, blocks that door. He's in a little hallway between the first door and then the second door that he drilled the peephole in. Goes ahead and peers through the peephole and sees Lincoln, his target, sitting right in front of the peephole.
So I'm guessing how it should have probably gone is you have the attendant, you then have the door. There's then the hallway that probably leads to it leads to the presidential booth, which has its own door. I'm guessing it might lead to a couple other of the balcony seats a little further down.
They said that where Rathbone and his chick were sitting was another box, but they had just pulled the partition down so all four of them could sit in there.
Yeah, I'm sure there was some further down, though, because he was 15 feet off the stage,
Yeah.
and if you're looking at it, he was stage right. Or is it if you're facing the stage out toward the audience, so stage left? Yeah, he was stage left about 15 feet up in the box. So I'm guessing that's where Parker should have been, is after that first door.
In the
because
hallway.
You're in that hallway right in front of the door. So as soon as he gets past that attendant, there's no one there to stop him. So like you said, he jams that door to not let anybody in, takes a look through the peephole. Lincoln's sitting there with his back to him in his rocking chair. He's the closest one. The door essentially leads in behind Lincoln. You then have Mary Todd sitting kind of, if you're sitting in Lincoln's position, probably off to like his 2 o'clock, a little bit down and to his right, and then over to his right further in this separate box, but the partition had been removed, so it was down. That would be where Rathbone and his wife were sitting.
Yeah, I'm trying to find this line in this play.
So, getting to what Adam's talking about, John Wilkes Booth had seen this play so many times that he knew and timed it for this section and waited for when there was going to be this joke and this big pop of laughter to where he could then use that as the sound to essentially disguise the gunshot. Now, he had a knife with him and he had a small Derringer pistol, which is a small one-shot pistol.
Yeah. So that is what I was talking about. Remember that Powell had the revolver.
Yeah.
Why in the fuck would Booth be the... I guess maybe for concealment purposes, because the single-shot Derringer was pretty small.
He's getting through an entire theater. If they have to try to pat him down, if the thing was hidden up his sleeve or something like that, versus Powell going into a house not really with the concern that he's going to have to be disguising anything from anybody.
But one shot is extremely confident.
Well, the theory was he was going to go ahead and shoot Lincoln, and then he would stab Grant, or at this point it was Rathbone. I don't know if he still had plans to kill Rathbone. I would imagine it would probably not be high on his priorities, as high as Grant would be, but Lincoln was definitely the 100% the priority.
Well, and he probably needed to eliminate all the male threats up there for him to get away.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he times this perfectly for this guy on stage named Harry Hawk. This is why I don't think I really understand theater, because, or maybe just humor back then. So he delivers this line, "Well, I guess you know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dizing old man trap." Is that just like an old whore?
What? I think so. I think he's calling her a whore.
I feel like there's a lot less words that you can use in that sentence, and funnier words.
Back. I think I might start bringing that back. That's a very flowery, polite way to call somebody a whore, apparently.
A sock-dizing old man trap.
Yeah.
So, we get a big boom from the audience.
Like a fucking laugh track. And during that laugh track, he sneaks in right behind. No one notices him come in. Apparently the door was kind of set back. It wasn't like you opened the door and like a foot in front of you was Lincoln. You opened it and you kind of had to move forward a little bit.
Real good hinges on that door. Real quiet hinges.
Oh, yeah. WD-40 on those. And basically puts the gun to the back of Lincoln's head, and as soon as this laugh hits, pulls the trigger and shoots Lincoln right in the back of the head.
Like that laugh was going to cover up a gunshot in a theater.
Well, they said that, like, because of course they're taking witness statements from people in the theater to see who saw what, make sure all the information, is consistent. They said that when that happened, because they were used to certain sounds in the theater of stuff being dropped backstage, or something might have happened in the orchestra pit if they had instruments, someone dropped it. It was supposed to just maybe catch people's attention, but not cause a panic.
I think a gunshot's going to make a really loud noise.
But such a small, it's just a pop. It's not like a large caliber. It was basically just, it's a single shot, so it's a ball.
Yeah.
It's black powder. It's really, it's not as loud when it's that small caliber, and you have, 80 to 100 people laughing all at the same time? Like, it's going to drown it out for the most part.
It was loud enough that Rathbone heard it.
Oh, yeah. Well, he probably turned and fucking saw it.
Yeah. Yeah, once the shot goes off, Rathbone, his attention is drawn over. The shot hits Lincoln, like, right below the base of the skull, travels through his brain, and I think they said stopped at his forehead.
Yeah.
So, real clean, good shot all the way in. Mm-hmm. Lincoln slumps over in his chair. Rathbone gets up. JWB pulls out the knife that he brought with him. There's a struggle between him and Rathbone. He ends up getting free. He slashes Rathbone. I think it was on the wrist. And then as he's making his escape, it was 12 feet? Is that?
15.
15 feet from the box down to the stage.
I think so.
And as he makes his escape, his plan was to jump down on the stage. Well, that banner that we were talking about that we can't remember the name of that seemed so insignificant gets caught in one of Booth's spurs.
Yeah, I didn't even think about this, too. Of course, if horses are your main mode of travel and you're riding them all the time,
Yep.
You're consistently wearing spurs. Uh-huh. You're just fucking wearing them at all times. So when you go to jump off, that thing fucking catches. He doesn't like face plant or anything, but he's also landing in fucking boots that have no cushion, no sole, 15 feet.
You don't know how to fall and brace yourself and break at the knees.
It probably wouldn't have worked well had he been able to just jump without catching himself on anything. But he catches himself. There's some debate about when he actually broke his leg. Some people claim that it hobbled him when he jumped off. It makes sense to me that, why people would think that. They said when he stood up, everyone was just like, that's John Wilkes Booth. What the fuck is going on? And as he stands up on the stage, of course, everyone is like, Huh? He holds up his knife and yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," which
There's,
is the state motto of Virginia.
and it's this or thus always to tyrants.
I I don't know if Latin is just lost on me, and I get like, e pluribus unum or whatever we have
E
for
pluribus
certain.
unum, yeah.
But what does that even mean? Thus always to tyrants.
I think maybe it was that he was holding up the bloody knife, and it's like, this is what tyrants get.
It doesn't make sense. It's lost.
No, yeah. I think this
It could have been "Long live the South." It could have been any number of things.
Yeah, it could have been, "Oh fuck, my shin bone just went through the front of my leg."
Uh-huh.
I mean, there's so many witness statements that said that they heard "Sic semper tyrannis," "Long live the South," all of these different phrases. I think "Sic semper tyrannis" was something that Brutus had said around the time that he had killed Caesar, potentially.
Oh,
So it
okay.
was almost like a little, again, callback to that.
okay.
But this is all just going off of witness statements. I think he does make reference in this little journal thing that he ends up keeping where he mentions "Sic semper." So I think that kind of reinforces what he said. Excuse me. But after that, he exits through a side door. As he's running out, the orchestra leader, had made an attempt to stop him. He just stabs the orchestra leader for, I guess, posterity on the way out the door. This does...
I never fucking liked you. You are always
Yeah.
trying to play me off the stage.
You were always offbeat, man. That's kind of interesting to think. I didn't really know about the debate of when he broke his leg. But to run off stage, you have to have the ultimate amount of adrenaline. But if that bone is so far out of your leg or out of your shin, I don't understand how you're putting weight on it.
So what they think, what makes more sense, what would have happened is you could definitely like twist your ankle
Yeah.
or something at that point, and that would still hobble you, but make you still able to try to get off stage. If you've got like a compound fracture, yeah, fuck that. But they also said that when he was riding to escape, his horse rolled over. And when his horse rolled over, that's what actually broke his leg.
I could believe that.
Yeah.
That makes more sense to me for sure. So he makes his escape.
Gets outside, jumps on the horse of a different person who's now holding probably some fucking kid, some intern or something, because the other guy got tired of holding his fucking horse. Fucking hits that guy in the head with his fucking like pistol or with the butt of his knife, and then just fucking takes off into the night.
And for what happened, after that at Ford's Theater, there was like a 23-year-old doctor that was in the crowd, and is there a doctor in the house? Is there a doctor in the house line? This guy eventually is like, well, yeah, he had just gotten his medical license.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what kind of witchcraft you have to go through for like a doctor's test back then. I don't think it was
sawed
a
off
lot.
4 feet, and I got my degree.
And only 2 guys died.
Mm-hmm. I got a 50-50 success rate, best in my class.
This was at a time too when they didn't really understand how germ theory worked. And so he goes up there, he rushes up, sees a very large hole in the back of Lincoln's head, thinks got to get the ball out, jams his finger up into the back of Lincoln's head. And they said that the infection that the finger gave was kind of secondary to just how bad the shot was.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's not regardless. That's not going to be what gets Lincoln. Yeah.
They did say, though, that he did dislodge a blood clot that had started to form, and that actually might have bought Lincoln some time. They kind of assumed that this was going to be the end of Lincoln. This wasn't something he was going to come back from. So they carried him probably as good as they could across the street to I don't know if it was a hotel or something like that.
Yeah.
They laid him in the bed. Turns out Lincoln, 6'4" man, 2 inches shorter than me, was so tall and the beds were so short back then that they had to lay him diagonal in the bed so his feet weren't his feet weren't hanging off the end of the bed. And that was where he stayed. He fought throughout the entire night and ended up expiring right around 7 a.m. This is another kind of cutesy thing that I think is a victim to history and telling a better story. But yeah, he dies 7 a.m. the next day. John Wilkes Booth crosses back into Maryland. There was some questions as to how he got across because there was a blockade leading into Maryland down the river still. Ends up making it back over into Maryland, and he met up with Harold at the Surratt Tavern.
Harold, who had been there surprisingly for quite a while.
And without Pal.
Yeah.
Like, hey man, where's Pal? Some shit went wrong, so I had to leave him.
This guy's fucking crazy, man.
Yeah. They load up on their guns, all their provisions they need to take. They realize that at this point, Booth's leg is in pretty dire straits.
This has become, at this point, the fugitive.
Yeah.
We're like Tommy Lee Jones out there. He's like, we're going to search every doghouse, outhouse, fox house, hen house until we get these guys. I want a perimeter, 20-mile radius around D.C.
And he's already in Maryland, so he's kind of a step ahead. They take off towards the south because that was always going to be the plan, was to make it back across the Mason-Dixon line or whatever they want to call it back then, for safety down in the south. They head down to a house that they run into. It was a guy that Booth knew, named Samuel Mudd, and he was a doctor. This was April 15th. So the following day, they get to Mudd's house. Booth's leg is really messed up. Another kind of funny little side point in this was Booth had gone out and purchased a fake beard and beard glue to try to hide himself. Mm-hmm. And him and Mudd had actually met before, but in order to keep this low profile, Booth put this beard on his face. Like it was a stage beard.
Like after the assassination.
Yeah.
Because everyone knew it was John Wilkes Booth at the theater, and it wasn't just, is that John Wilkes Booth in a beard?
Word hadn't gotten out yet because we're still talking about the slowness of what's going on, but just to cover his tracks, he wanted to make sure that he was covered up.
Also, fun fact, the saying his name is Mudd, when you're talking about someone like he has no credibility or he's, dead to you or anything, comes from Dr. Samuel Mudd.
Are you sure?
I'm very, very sure.
Look it up.
Okay.
Because I had heard that it dated back a little bit further.
Okay.
But I could be wrong on that. So Mudd's working on him, and he's leaned over, working on his leg, and Booth is looking down, and Mudd's wife is standing behind him and looks up at Booth's face and realizes that the beard has started to come off of Booth's face.
So Samuel Mudd, the physician who was convicted as a conspirator after he set the broken ankle of John Wilkes Booth. The expression was first recorded in 1823 when Mudd was slain for a stupid or fool person. Oh, guess you're right.
Huh. So Mudd's wife sees the beard coming off of Booth's face, and Booth realizes it too and sits back forward and sticks the beard back to his face, like trying to keep up this facade. They wanted to get on a ride that night because they still needed to get south. But Mudd's like, you're not going anywhere, man. This compound is nasty. Mm-hmm. Like, this is really, really bad. Stay here a night. That night, Mudd and his wife go up to the room, and Mrs. Mudd's like, hey, did you notice he was wearing a fake beard? Mudd's like, that is kind of weird. Mudd rolls into town the next day, and this is where he first hears about the shooting of Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And once he hears that, he's like, well, these two guys just showed up in the middle of the night. This guy's got a compound fracture, but they kind of seem like they're really worried about something. I wonder if it's them. Mudd goes back to the house. He's like, hey, you're scaring my wife. This is a weird situation. You guys got to move on. So he ends up taking off from Mudd's house. Him and Harold do. Once they get out of there, they continue down south. They land at a place, the farm of a guy named Samuel Cox. He's a Confederate supporter. His brother, I believe, works as a Confederate spy in their spy group. Cox hides them in a thicket kind of out off of his land. The Union troops are starting to spread out now, and they're really looking around. We'll get to the guy who kind of takes control of it. His name, I believe, starts with an S, too. He was
Edwin Stanton.
Stanton, yes.
So just kind of a brief thing on Edward Stanton. So he's actually the Secretary of War. So during the Civil War, had a huge, huge role to play. Basically, as soon as Lincoln was shot, he basically, I don't want to use the term seize his power, but seize his power is the best way to do it because everyone else is kind of not in a position to do so. Andrew Johnson might have been able to, but I don't know if they knew exactly where he was or if they...
He was being sworn in.
He was being sworn in. Okay, so he was busy doing that. Obviously, William Seward, Secretary of State, can't do shit because he's not only fucking bedridden due to a carriage accident, he's also been fucking slashed a whole shit ton of times. So Stanton steps in and basically takes over control of the government. They said there's some conspiracies about Stanton possibly being a part of this or because he stepped in so quickly. I don't think he had anything to do with it. I just
No.
think he was a guy that was an opportunist that saw an opening and was like, well, if I can be the one to organize catching his killer, that's probably a good bid for me to be president in the future or some shit.
Oh yeah, no, it's going to look very, very good if you can do it. So these Union troops are getting closer and closer. Cox is like, you guys got to ditch the horses. You don't have any provisions for them to go any further. You're running out of food. They drown their horses, or they shoot their horses, and then they drown them in a bog. Cox calls up his brother that's in
Couldn't they
the...
just let the horses go?
I don't know if you can with
They gonna go
broken
tell on
horses, though, right?
I don't know.
I think they just kind of hang around, even if you pulled your saddle and everything
You
off
could
of
literally
them.
tie him to a tree and just leave him.
But the Union troops are going to be like, how are these horses tied to this tree?
Oh, I got. And so you're saying they sunk him in a bog?
Yeah,
Okay.
so they couldn't be seen.
Gotcha.
Cox's brother-in-law or brother, whoever it was, comes up and gets him, and he was supposed to be taking them down to cross the river. One of the other things that he was doing at Cox's house was he was trying to get a hold of as many papers as possible. He wanted to see what the news was. He wanted to see kind of the spoils. He wanted to see people celebrating him for what he did. And all these newspapers that he's getting are just the saddest write-ups about Lincoln possible, just how Lincoln was a hero and everybody loved him, and that Booth was a sick, sad individual. And he really kind of started his self-reflection, and some of it is told in this diary that he writes, but he talks about how he should be celebrated like Brutus, like William Tell, a guy who I had to look up because I really didn't have any idea besides the crossbow of what he did, but he assassinated Habsburg, according to legend. And he's like, well, why don't these people love me? These people should love me. He was a tyrant.
Well,
he was a bad, bad man.
Yeah, his whole belief in what would happen after this assassination occurred is that because he had essentially cut off the leadership structure of the Union, that it would somehow revitalize the Confederacy to go ahead and renew the fight. And because the Union would be in such chaos without its figurehead, that the South could then win this renewed Civil War, which, and I kind of mentioned this to you when we were texting back and forth. This to me is when you 100% believe that this comes out of the mouth of a 26-year-old actor.
Yeah.
Because to have zero understanding of the fact that when they, first of all, they weren't giving prisoners back. Secondly, you just took the key piece for the Confederate Army off the board in Robert E. Lee by having him do a surrender and his army surrender, which were probably the best trained troops.
Yeah, by far.
You have, at this point, even though it's only 5 days into the surrender and everything being signed, you had Union troops who were in the South who at this point now have control of key areas in the South. So it's not like you're starting back at square one where everyone's on their side of the board. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think like the army's going to get like a little bit of wind up its ass and turn this thing completely around? They're at
No generals.
Yeah, with no generals. They're already in such a surrender was because they could not keep fighting. Yeah. That was the whole point. So like the fucking delusion to think, and at some point too, it was you gotta believe that it went from being for the good of the South to just delusion of being like, I'm going to be a Southern hero. It was more for his own gratification, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, this was a self-serving mission. And once he saw that everybody disagreed with what he did, I think it kind of took a little wind out of his sails, but he didn't quit fighting. He didn't quit trying to get back across.
He would still be a hero to a pretty big portion of people in the South. They
Yeah.
didn't think they should have lost the war or anything like that. He would be someone that, of course, because everything, the secession didn't work, it wasn't going to work, the South was going to be part of the United States again. It wasn't like he wasn't going to be hunted, but at this point, escape was his only option to try to get maybe down to the places where that Knights of the Golden Circle or some shit like that. I don't know.
Yeah, he just needed a way out. He didn't have a very happy 420 that year. He read in the newspaper that most of the co-conspirators that he had been caught. April 23rd, Thomas Harbin agrees to get them across the river. He says that he doesn't want any sort of money or anything like that from him because he doesn't want to be tied to him. He wasn't going to help them across the river. And the reason crossing the Potomac was so tough was there were Union boats out there patrolling the area to make sure that nobody would get across. So him and Harold end up launching and lose their sense of direction, which I don't know how you would do in a river because it's a river.
Night.
Yeah, true.
We're like, imagine there's like no natural light or no man-made light.
You are out in the middle of fucking nowhere and electricity is not.
It is dark. There's no type of, you even look at our city where you go outside and you're like, man, the fucking sky is light from all the light pollution. If there's nothing, it's fucking, And you can't have a lantern on the boat because everyone will see you.
Yeah, I gotta assume April at night over there in D.C., it's probably a little foggy over the river.
He's also probably still... You gotta imagine, man, after he left the doctor's house, you would be in such pain.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think he's probably on morphine or something at this point, trying to go ahead and numb the pain?
No amount of liquor is going to take the edge off
so
that.
You gotta imagine he's probably a little bit fucking delirious, not making the best decisions.
So yeah, they end up landing back on the Maryland side, which the next day they did give it a shot again. They found a break to get across the river. They crossed down into Virginia. So they're one step closer to being home free. JWB and Harold arrive at Richard Garrett's farm in King George County in Virginia. And his ploy was that they're two Confederate soldiers coming back home from war. That's what happened to his leg. Richard Garrett's like, yeah, you're a little odd, but I guess, this is cool. Garrett's son goes into town the next day, hears about the shooting, hears that Stanton had put up like $100,000 reward, something like that. And for people living in King George County, $100,000 definitely sounds like it wouldn't be too bad. Goes back, tells his dad. They're like, well, we don't know for sure. This guy said he's a Confederate soldier. JWB was acting a little bit weird. They said that he was drunk and playing with the kids, which is off-putting to anybody when a stranger gets drunk and tries to play with your kids. So they send Harold and Booth.
Like, no more staying in the house for you.
Yeah.
But we have a very comfortable tobacco barn that your ass is going to go sleep in. So they take him out to the tobacco barn, and they end up locking him in the barn. I don't know if he was aware that they had locked the door and everything.
No.
They were probably just happy to be in a place that had shelter and protection.
They said that Garrett was concerned about him making off with his horses, so after they got into the barn, Garrett went and locked the barn behind him.
Well, at this point, they had to have maybe kind of a feeling that something wasn't going their way.
Yeah. You're sleeping in a barn.
Well, April 26th, so we're talking, a couple days later, they were sleeping in the barn on the property when the 16th New York Cavalry ended up rolling up. You got to imagine, and you're just like, your asshole just instantly fucking puckers.
Oh, that sounds like a northern song, doesn't it?
So they end up surrounding the barn. They come out there, they're talking to good old Thomas Harbin, or not Thomas Harbin, they're talking to good old Richard Garrett, and he's like, yeah, they're out in the barn, they're locked out there. They go out there, and...
They're locked in my barn.
Yeah, I locked these sons of bitches in my barn. At this point, it is just him and Harold, right?
Yep.
Okay. So, how do you, do you come out there and you're like, who are you? John Wilkes Booth, come out. Like, what do you... Because you can't know it's him. You have to suspect maybe it's, someone involved with it, but, how do you end up identifying the person? Tell us who you are?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really... I think it's just they knew that one guy was on the run. He could have potentially been with somebody else. And you just kind of take it as your best guess is okay, this has to be them. The story doesn't match up. I'm sure probably at that point, Garrett was like, we heard about the shooting. We heard about the reward. We don't know if it's this guy, but I bet it's probably this guy.
Who has to confirm that? Because you go up and you peeking through the slats? Because they're fucking armed. Who has to draw the short straw? We got to identify these guys. All right, who's the new guy? All right, you got to go up there and peek through the slats.
Yeah, just don't choose a knothole that's too big, because he's going to try to shoot through it. They identify Harold and Booth. They tell him to come out. Harold shows the bravery that he showed when he was helping out Pal, and immediately he's like, I surrender. I'm good. You guys can come and take me. I'm unarmed, I believe is what he yelled. They come up, they grab him, they yank him out of the barn, and this could be, for all the dumb shit that John Wilkes Booth had done, we didn't even talk about his plan to kidnap Lincoln. One of Booth's plans to kidnap Lincoln was they were going to ambush him at the theater and tie him up and then drop him from a rope.
Lower him down out of some type of fucking Wile E. Coyote winch and pulley system after they tied him up. Like, you know when they're lowering bodies down for Everest? Yes. And they just have them tied up? They just like are slowly lowering. While there's a fucking play going on. Like, nobody fucking move. And then, careful. Don't drop him. Nobody fucking move.
Yeah, dude, I'm sure everybody else that was listening to this was like, can we get a 5? Is this guy really our leader?
The band starts playing like the Keystone Cops music.
This dumb motherfuckers really think we're going to lower the president of the United States
so
down.
This definitely plays into his next request.
Yeah, his next request is that would it be the general of the cavalry?
Mm-hmm. Or whoever was in charge.
Yeah, whoever's in charge of the cavalry, he threatened and I guess challenged him to a duel. He said, everybody else drop your weapons. I'll come out. You and I handle this like men. Which seems like the most desperate, dumb request for somebody who's in a barn surrounded by
the
cavalry.
orders are to take this guy alive.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not on the side of the cavalry that showed up here. It is definitely not their intention to kill. They want to take this motherfucker alive.
And the duel thing, I don't know how he thought that was going to be received, but I have to imagine there was guys out there just laughing their ass off as soon as he challenged him to a duel.
Yeah,
yeah, dude, that's sure. Come on out.
That's not a fucking thing anymore, dude.
We've reached a different time in life.
So what do you do when someone's not willing to come out? Because they weren't going to go and get him because essentially he would just start shooting, and it was at a risk of all these other Union guys. They were probably in the mindset of like, we didn't survive the entire Civil War to be fucking shot and killed by this guy in this fucking barn. So
we don't know how good of a shot he is, but we know how good of a shot he had one time.
Yeah, like they're not going to go and risk this, and so they're all outside the barn waiting for him to come out. Well, when your prey does not come out of the barn, you fucking smoke him out. And what better way or what better place to set fire to than a building made of wood stuffed with dried tobacco leaves?
Seems like it would be pretty burnable.
So they set fire to the barn, and basically as I don't know if he was coming out or he was getting ready to come out, but there was smoke filling out the thing. I think this guy, was his name Boston Corbett? I think he shot him through a gap in the boards for the barn and caught him right in the neck. And I think they said the shot went in and then it went out toward the back and it clipped his spinal cord.
Severed his spinal cord.
And he just fucking went down. And as soon as he went down, they ran in there and they fucking dragged his ass out.
This brings up two things for me. First off, this Boston Corbett guy had already been kicked out of the army one time before, and they said that he had suffered so much mercury poisoning that his brain was just mush, and so he was able to function, but he didn't have a whole lot of, like, let's hold back. He said that he was concerned about him coming out of the barn and wanted to make sure that he didn't escape again. And this is like
didn't kill his friends. It was something like that.
Yeah.
Or he thought they were all in danger from this guy.
This was the original South Park, like early seasons, when Uncle Jimbo yells, "They're coming right for us," when it's just like an innocent animal to shoot them. Yeah. I'm sure Boston Corbett was like, "He's coming right for us."
It's not like this guy didn't deserve it, though.
But the orders were to take him alive.
Correct. I feel like there was someone, we got cheated.
Yeah.
We got cheated as a society for this guy being able to go out like this.
We didn't get to witness the hanging. We just got to hear about the shooting.
Yes, we didn't get any national catharsis for it.
So they drag him out, and he is only able to talk when you sever the spinal cord. You obviously can't move your arms or your legs or anything like that. He's not a threat anymore. As he's laying there, I guess one of the soldiers leans in as he's kind of gargling and saying things. He says, "Tell my mother I die for my country," which sort of seems like if your mother didn't want you to fight in the war, she probably didn't want you to die for the country. And you died for the country after you just shot the leader of the country.
Yeah.
Another request that he had, and this is Tropic Thunder, Ben Stiller to a T. He asked one of the soldiers to lift his hands up so he could see him, and he held his hands up in front of his face, and he's just like, useless, useless. This is Ben Stiller with his hands blown off at the beginning of the scene. So I don't know what the hand thing was, but it's so fucking funny that some of his last words were just cursing at himself for his useless hands after he just killed the fucking president. So,
like I said, I think at this point it's days since he broke this. Yeah, he did see a doctor, but you got to imagine trying to travel, probably moving through some undesirable like
riding
terrain,
a horse,
sleeping
the
outside.
river.
You're not getting medical treatment. No. I'm thinking fever's got to be setting in, infection, a little bit of the crazies.
Yeah, I just probably lost what was left of his mind. So yeah, that's his ending. Pal and Mary Surratt, again, just an awesome story. The police were actually at Surratt's boarding house, and they were questioning her because they had known that Booth had spent a lot of time there. This is at night, like days later, as they're questioning Surratt. Pal comes rolling up while they're there, and they go, "What's your business here?" And he goes, she had me digging a sewer out back, still covered in blood because he made a bloodbath of Seward.
And had been hiding the entire time.
Yep. Had been hiding out in the woods, wherever he was. Finally makes it back, and they're like, well, Mary, is this true? And Mary's quick thinking, she goes, I've never seen that man before in my life. What the fuck? If you're going to lie, at least try to have a cohesive story, because as soon as you're like, that guy said he's digging a sewer for you, you just said you don't know him. There's obviously...
She's trying to save her ass.
Yeah, there's got to be something in between. She's distancing
herself as much as possible without the foresight of being like, oh, there's all this other shit tying me to it.
So
it was just saying anything you could to try to protect yourself in the moment without having a grain of logic to it.
Yeah, and maybe that was it. She was just trying to save her ass, and Powell came up with just the worst lie ever. And he has to have the worst timing in the history of timing to show up when they're there questioning her. Atzerodt was arrested at his cousin's farm in Germantown in Maryland, like we were talking about. John Surratt, however, the son of Mary, he made quite the caper. He actually escaped up into Quebec. He boarded a ship into Quebec and went over into, I believe it was England.
He wasn't even there in the city during the assassination, though, I think.
No, but he
was a conspirator, yes. He definitely had a hand in planning it or facilitating it in some way, shape, or form.
He ends up taking off through the Middle East and is caught years later in Egypt.
How?
How do you make it to Egypt in the 1860s, dude?
How do you get caught after making it to Egypt?
Yeah, I guess that's true. How much are they looking for Lincoln's assassins to find this guy? Yeah, I didn't even think about it from that angle. That's
got to be a situation where he was found by, like, whatever British forces were there.
Could have been. We were probably in good graces with England again, for sure. So, could have been, for sure. The rest of the conspirators, Samuel Arnold, George Atzerodt, David Harold, Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, Lewis Powell, Ed Spangler, the guy that was holding the horse and got hit in the head.
Well, he was the one holding.
Booth.
Oh, he was the one that got handed the horse, not the first guy.
Oh, he wasn't the guy that got hit. He was just the initial handoff.
I can't remember which one he was.
Well, he was one of the guys.
Neither of them should have been.
No, they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Mary Surratt all face trial. This is again where there's some goofy shit going on with Stanton. Instead of having just a regular public civil trial where you actually have like legitimate jury of your own peers and all that stuff, he was concerned because again, he didn't quite know if you could get an entire jury that would all be caring of your cause.
Yeah.
So he goes ahead and puts him in front of a military tribunal, which, of course, after the Civil War, if you take out Lincoln, you're definitely not going to win that. Mary Surratt, Powell, Harold, and Atzerodt were all hanged.
Mary Surratt was the first woman that was executed.
Yeah.
in United States history as far as like being executed for crimes against the government. Not like because witches got fucking
That's what I was
executed all
going
the
to say.
time,
Yeah,
but the first woman that was tried and convicted and was executed.
well, and I'm sure that was after we became the United States, and the witch trials were back when it was a colony. So
Yeah.
maybe that kind of makes sense, but definitely not on American soil.
For an actual crime, not the crime of like the neighbor getting sick and then blaming it on you because you like had a spider crawling out of your house or some shit.
the crime of being a nag. O'Loughlin ends up dying in prison in 1867. This, I think, we talked about it a little before during the study, kind of blows me away. Mudd, Arnold, and Spangler were all pardoned by President Johnson in 1869. I kind of understand it on the face that, like, Mudd didn't, excuse me, really know who he was treating.
At the same time, too, was the Hippocratic Oath a thing back then that you were like required to try to help a person? Was that still a thing that doctors thought, but like it was your duty to try to, if you were able to cause no harm, and by doing nothing, you were essentially causing harm?
Yeah, I can see that.
Maybe that's where that came from, is that's what he used as his defense. He's like, there's this thing called the Hippocratic Oath. And it says doctors aren't allowed to hurt somebody, and that means inaction could hurt them as well.
Yeah, I can't be a hypocrite. I was trained to do this for a reason.
Exactly.
So I can kind of understand him getting pardoned. Arnold was just a conspirator. He didn't take part in anything. I can kind of see that. Spangler, just, again, wrong place, wrong time. O'Loughlin didn't really do anything either. But the pardoning done by President Johnson in 1869 feels really, really too close to the time of what had just happened to the president to start pardoning.
I agree, and I thought that a couple other guys had gotten pardoned as well. That's why I kind of had the strong take on, like, I don't think it was the right decision. If it was just those guys knowing what capacity they served in this, yeah, they should have been pardoned. The doctor, especially not knowing, fucking Spangler 100% just holding the fucking horse of a fucking, essentially what would be a movie star. Of course,
Yeah.
like, I look up to the fucking, like, what do you mean? I had no idea what was fucking going on. By the time I did, he was jumping on the horse and he fucking why would I get punched in the face or hit in the fucking head? But yeah, I can definitely agree with that.
The whole Andrew Johnson thing was, it was very Ford-esque. Because Andrew Johnson is now the one that's in charge of Reconstruction, healing the nation, rebuilding the country, as well as rebuilding the South. Part of the reason that Lincoln took a lot of flack, and part of this was on Sherman, because Sherman was a total war guy. When he would go in and take troops into the South, you were going to slash and burn everything, and their economy was just going to be shit after that.
Trying to win the war as quickly as possible.
Yeah, no, war strategy, it makes total sense. But the 30,000-foot view of seeing what Reconstruction would take after that to destroy the entire Southern economy almost destroys most of the nation's economy, because
You're weakened at that point once you're absorbing all of that weakened economy and having to build it back up.
Yeah, and you're also, all of your textiles factories and everything like that in the North are all being supplied by the cotton farms in the South. So there's kind of a symbiotic relationship where they needed it. Trying to rebuild the South was going to be so tough. And Johnson kind of helped usher it in by letting a lot of the senators that had voted for secession back into the government.
Yeah.
Which seems like a bad move, and it can be looked upon as like trying to let bygones be bygones.
It's an olive branch situation. Yeah.
Yeah, these motherfuckers though, they seceded for a reason.
From our view, hundreds of years later, it's easy to look at that and be like, well, fuck that. They started the war and everything. But it's just like the thing we're talking about with Lincoln. Again, I don't particularly like Andrew Johnson, but at the same time, being put in an impossible situation and being like, I guess I just got to do fucking whatever it takes to try to get this ship back on the right course.
Yeah.
And being a human being in that you're maybe not going to go about things the exact right way.
And still your heart is in Tennessee.
Yeah.
It's
your
in
heart's
the
in
South.
Dixie.
Yeah. Getting back to John Surratt, he was caught in 1867, so he was on the run for 2 years and somehow made it all the way to Egypt. Got brought back. He actually was tried in front of a civil court, and it was in D.C., and they couldn't reach a verdict. So he ends up getting a mistrial and is set free. Which again, he didn't kill anybody. He wasn't a real big player in the plot, but he also helped organize everything on
He
the
also
back end.
ran.
Huh?
He also ran.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He knew that he
yeah.
was guilty when he took off to Quebec and then
Yeah,
made it to Egypt.
yeah.
So he had a guilty conscience for sure.
Yeah.
But this whole plot is so much bigger than I think what we were ever taught in school. There's so much of this stuff that I learned about. John Wilkes Booth, for being as bad of a guy as he was 26, I think.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, you said that a couple times. But a 26-year-old assassinating a president after he had become uber famous in a matter of like 10 years of being this big actor. We don't, like I said earlier, the assassinator is usually not known by the assassinatee, but the assassinator was known by everybody in the country, basically.
Yeah, I see him, like, for some reason, just like in a comical way, I see him staring in the mirror and be like, you're going to be the biggest star. You're going to kill the president and everyone's going to know your name. You're going to be bigger than you are right now. You're going to be famous. Everyone in the South will love you when they rise back up again, and it'll all be because of you. President John Wilkes Booth. Now go get him, Tiger, as he puts on his fake beard.
Yeah. Yeah, you're already famous, man. You don't need it. This was purely for just self-gain and to try to get back at somebody who you had felt wronged you when really you were just the one that was in the wrong the entire time. Like I say, Lincoln was no saint. I've learned that pretty heavily through this episode and through the Civil War episode, but he was a guy that kind of did what needed to be done in order for us to have a...
You can argue with the methods, you can't argue with the results.
Yep, exactly. That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
It's just you have to have the outcome, and I don't think if Booth got away. I mean, clearly this changed nothing.
Yeah.
I don't know what Lincoln's reach would have been into Reconstruction had this not happened. I don't know quite what would have been different because, again, Lincoln was sympathetic to the South, but he just believed that he had to do what he had to do. So would Reconstruction have gone faster? Would Jim Crow may not have been so widely accepted in the South if Lincoln had been like, yeah, I freed these guys. You can't keep fucking with them or anything like that. But ultimately, I don't know if Lincoln would have had a seismic change.
And I don't know if we would have looked at him the same.
No. He had a chance to really fuck some stuff up because, again, he got killed like a month and a half into his second term.
Yeah.
So you had another 3 years where I think Johnson was actually president, didn't have
People
a vice
weren't
president.
done partying about the war being over. People were still celebrating and partying and having parades and all that kind of stuff when this happened. But yeah, just a much bigger topic than we were ever taught in school. We covered this in the span of a period of United States history when, it probably should have had a lot more dedicated to it. Could have turned out way different had all three of them succeeded. What would that have looked like?
That would have been interesting. Had Johnson gone down, had Seward gone down. I don't know if they had a confusion on the line of succession as far as how that would go. I believe it would go president to vice president to the Senate pro tempore, which is like the guy that presides over the Senate when the vice president isn't around. So that guy, I don't know his name, but he would have been the third guy in the line to take the presidency. I think if succession it had to have already been implemented at that point.
Yeah.
They probably thought of the line of succession before they thought, hey, we should give these guys more security.
Yeah. Not really focused on we could get rid of this whole secession issue and not make it such a big thing if we just don't let this guy die.
Yeah. Yep,
nope.
Cart before the horse.
Yeah, that hasn't happened yet, so we're not worried about that. But yeah, a really, really interesting topic. I'm glad we did a dive into this and kind of like got into, it's the centerpiece of this story, but there's just a lot going on around it and a lot going on about like the players, that it wasn't just a random act, that it was in the works for a long, long time. And it was set up with key players that had to be in the positions that they were in for this thing to even work.
Yeah, this is our history. This is something that I feel like we probably should have known a little bit more about. I understand the constraints of teaching in high school or junior high or whenever we would have learned about this. But at the same time, like, if we're going to be as patriotic as we are, we kind of need to know the ins and the outs of how everything went.
Yeah. All right, man. You got anything else?
No, I think we're good.
All right, guys. Thanks again for joining us. Remember, rate, review, subscribe, If you want to keep supporting the podcast, we love those 5-star reviews. That actually helps us gain more advertisers, things like that help us keep this thing rocking for you guys. So you guys keep rocking on your end.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.